I woke up in agony. My head felt like it had been through a blender, and my whole body was burning. The last thing I remembered was pulling an all-nighter after days of overtime at work, then sitting down to play one round of Civilization 6. Next thing I knew, I blacked out. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a donkey cart, covered with a ragged blanket, bouncing along a muddy road. A blonde girl with green eyes was holding my head in her lap, keeping me from choking on my own nosebleed. Around us stretched a long convoy of refugees, crying children, braying donkeys, people in torn clothes carrying bundles on their backs. The girl shouted that I'd woken up, and a huge Viking-looking man with a horned helmet and a bushy beard climbed onto the cart to check on me. He grabbed my head, turned it side to side, and grumbled that I'd been unconscious for 3 days. The donkey screamed under his weight, and the girl, his daughter, apparently, shoved him off before the whole cart tipped over. Then the memories hit me. Not my memories. They belonged to the body's original owner, a guy named Leo Mondo. He'd been the new militia captain for this refugee caravan. In those memories, over 100 dog-headed creatures, kobolds, had ambushed the convoy from a hillside. They looked like oversized golden retrievers standing upright, with human-like hands and feet, but canine fangs and claws. Most were barely 4 feet tall, rushing downhill in a chaotic swarm like kids stampeding toward a school cafeteria. The militia had dealt with these attacks before. They'd form a shield wall, fight briefly, kill a dozen kobolds, and the rest would run away. Easy, but this time was different. Halfway through their charge, the kobold chief barked a command, and every single kobold hurled its spear at once. 100 javelins rained down on us. The militia was caught off guard, shields shattered, men dropped. In seconds, we lost a third of our fighters. The shield wall started falling apart. Leo went berserk. He blocked a javelin with his shield, split one kobold's skull open, and dragged a wounded soldier back into formation. Then, seeing his comrades being torn apart, he completely lost it. He charged straight at the kobold chief, the biggest, meanest one of them all, a muscle-bound beast carrying a heavy chain hammer. One swing of that hammer smashed Leo's shield to pieces and cracked the bones in his left hand. But Leo drove his sword deep into the chief's gut and twisted. The chief didn't care about its own wound. It smashed Leo in the chest with the hammer, tackled him to the ground, and bit down on his shoulder. Leo's bearskin shoulder guard barely saved him from losing his whole arm. With his left hand gone numb and his right hand still grinding his blade through the chief's insides, Leo did the only thing left. He bit down on the kobold chief's neck. They stayed locked together like that, tearing into each other, until Leo passed out from blood loss. So that was how I started my new life, by biting a kobold to death. Everything hurt so much I almost wished I'd just died at my desk back home instead. I wanted to go back. I shook my head carefully, trying to push through the dizziness. Bit by bit, the leftover memories in this body's brain fed me some background. This world was a classic Western fantasy setting. Gods, multiple races, the whole deal. The country I was in, the Orantis Empire, sat on the eastern side of a continent called Dawn Land, right next to the Orc territories in the frozen north. Centuries ago, Orantis had been a mighty empire that conquered the southern kingdoms and drove the orcs and trolls deep into the northern wastelands. But like all great empires, it eventually crumbled into feuding lords fighting over power. The northern provinces were now ruled by a Grand Duke named Mitchell from the Odolov family, and he'd been pulling his troops south to fight for control of the empire. That left the northern border wide open, and orc raiding parties started crossing the river again, burning villages. My village got hit first. If it weren't for Uncle Uriyen, a retired soldier who came home and whipped our joke of a militia into shape, we'd have been ashes like every other village nearby. But after holding out for a year, Uncle Uriyen made a bold call: pack up the entire village and migrate southwest across 1,000 miles, all the way to the foot of a place called the Grand Barrier, to a river bend where he'd been stationed years ago. He even got an official pioneer charter from the local noble family, the Frelevs. If we could tame enough wild land and pay enough taxes, he could earn the title of Pioneer Knight. As for the original owner of this body, Leo Mondo, the guy was basically a feral dog in human form. His mom died giving birth to him. His dad drank himself to death, and Leo grew up stealing food, picking fights, and kicking stray dogs in the street. At 15, he'd beaten up every man in the village. Then Uncle Urian came home and beat him with one hand, dragged him into the militia, and finally gave him some direction. He was 17 now, slightly less stupid than before, but only slightly. I looked up at Olivia. That was the blonde girl's name. My voice came out like sandpaper scraping metal. I could taste blood in my mouth and had no idea if it was mine or the Kobold Chief's. My left arm was splinted and tied up, probably broken. My ribs were definitely cracked from that chain hammer hit, and I kept coughing blood, which meant internal damage. The shoulder wound was actually the least of my worries. The iron-lined bearskin guard had kept the Kobold Chief's fangs from ripping my arm off entirely. The bite holes had already scabbed over. As long as I didn't get rabies, I'd live. The kobolds? I asked. You chased them off, Olivia said quietly, her body trembling slightly at the memory. She'd watched the whole thing from behind the cart, that massive, muscle-bound Kobold Chief thrashing and clawing on the ground, tearing Leo's armor and clothes to shreds, blood flying everywhere. But Leo's jaws had locked onto its throat like a steel trap and never let go, not until the thing suffocated and died. After that, the rest of the kobolds lasted less than a minute before fleeing in panic. I nodded, but I was worried. We'd started this journey with nearly 1,000 people and over 100 armed militia, including veterans like Uncle Urian. But over a month on the road, passing through comfortable little towns along the way, anyone with money, skills, or options had quietly slipped away. Now we were down to less than 300, mostly old folks, women, and children. The fighters numbered maybe 100, and the real militia was under 50. And according to Leo's memories, the area around our destination had several more tribes just as strong as these kobolds. Could our shrunken little caravan really survive what was coming? Don't worry, Leo. Just rest and heal. Daddy will handle everything. Olivia stroked my forehead, full of faith in her father. I smiled back at her and said nothing. So this was it. No more Leo. From now on, there was only me, Leo Mondo. Transmigrator, Kobold Biter, Militia Captain. We're almost there. Don't stop. Uncle Urian kept shouting from the front of the caravan, day after day. Following his rough hand-drawn map, we'd traveled south for over 1,000 miles along something called the World Tree Road. After more than a month of walking, we reached the old watchtower where Uncle Urian used to be stationed, then turned west along the Anzino River. Just 30 more miles through untouched forest, and we'd reach our destination, the river bend. Those last 30 miles were harder than the entire 1,000 before them. Forget the wild animals watching us from the shadows. The kobolds alone ambushed us 4 times. The last attack was the worst, killing and wounding more people than the first 3 combined. Out of 50 militia, only half could still fight. And their captain, me, was flat on his back in a cart. But the kobolds weren't even our biggest problem. With no roads, our heavily loaded caravan crawled at a snail's pace. Wheels got stuck in mud. Carts flipped over. Axles snapped. Donkeys panicked or just refused to move. Rain, snow, fallen trees blocking the path. Villagers having breakdowns, getting sick. Even a tiny cliff barely 10 feet high could hold us up for half a day. How much farther? Can't we just stay here? People cried. Tomorrow. We'll be there tomorrow. Uncle Urian would climb onto a boulder, wave his horned helmet, and shout, "Fat fish you can catch with your bare hands." Elk running everywhere. Trees for the cutting. Rich, fertile land. Everyone will eat their fill. He'd been saying the same thing the whole trip. The kids had even turned it into a song. But somehow it worked. It kept people going when they had nothing left. And after countless tomorrows, we finally arrived. The river bend was a huge peninsula formed by centuries of sediment. A wide, flat plain covered in tall dead grass, dotted with small lakes and little hills with scraggly bushes. Unlike the dense ancient forest on both sides of the river, this land was open. The grass was thigh-high even in winter, its thick roots too tough for the snow to flatten. Even I could tell this was excellent farmland. By then I'd been lying in that cart for 6 days total, and I could finally stand and walk again. The original Leo's memories had been crashing into my brain the whole time. Random, chaotic fragments that slowly changed how I thought and acted. Luckily, the real Leo had always been a bit of a space case, and I'd been stuck on the cart unable to move, so nobody noticed anything off about me. The caravan stopped on a gravel beach by the river. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, though most people looked more lost than happy. Uncle Urian jumped onto a cart and started barking orders, sending the dazed villagers off to chop wood, cook food, and set up camp. I wandered away from the chaos and sat on a big rock by the riverbank. The Anzino River stretched before me, borne high up in the Grand Barrier Mountains, falling from thousands of feet up, flowing northeast for over 1,000 miles before joining the North Ice River and emptying into the frozen sea. Here at the source, the river wasn't too wide, about 50 meters normally, but at the bend it spread to over 100 meters, slowing into something like a small lake. The water was crystal clear, and I could see schools of fish drifting around. To the west, snow-covered mountains rose into the sky, and behind them, sheer cliffs shot straight up and disappeared into the clouds. That was the Grand Barrier, a massive circular wall of rock in the center of the continent, like a giant tree stump growing out of flat ground. Waterfalls cascaded down its face, one after another. It was incredible. Across the river to the north, endless forests stretched to the horizon. Enormous pines so thick several people couldn't wrap their arms around them, branches heavy with snow. A herd of elk as tall as horses was drinking at the far bank. A few fawns stared at me curiously. Uncle Urian had told us that land used to be a vast grassland called the Wolf Drive Plains, where the beast races once bred their war wolves. 1,000 years ago, after the beasts were driven north, orc shamans and elven druids worked together to cover it all in forest, burying countless ruins beneath the trees. The man could make anything sound epic. That was his gift. Besides his fighting skills, he had a storyteller's tongue. After a while, Olivia came to check my wounds. Once she was satisfied everything was healing, she put on her stern face. Your tent is set up. Go lie down if you're tired. Don't wander around. Understood? Understood. I watched the scenery a bit longer, then the freezing wind drove me back to camp. My tent was a small patchwork of different animal hides, trophies from Leo's years of hunting. Most of the fur had worn down to fuzz from bad tanning and heavy use, but it was warm, and that made it one of the nicer shelters in camp. Outside the tent, a tiny mud-covered kid sat huddled against the wall, shivering under a blanket so full of holes it barely counted as fabric. I walked over and kicked him inside. Little mouse, find anything to eat today? I know. That was the original Leo's reflex, not mine. Years of living half-wild had hardwired roughness into this body's instincts. I pulled the kick at the last second, but it still sent the kid tumbling across the tent into the pile of furs. He shook his head silently, no expression on his thin face. Nothing. Little Mouse was barely 4 feet tall, skin and bones, wearing almost nothing in this cold. He had black hair and black eyes, rare for the north. I'd found him about 10 days ago, curled up under a donkey cart in the snow, lying on that same tiny blanket. It was barely big enough to lie on, let alone cover himself with. He'd been frozen nearly solid. Maybe it reminded Leo of his own childhood. He'd grabbed the kid, tossed him into his tent's fur pile, and fed him his own breakfast. Somehow the boy survived, and after that he just followed the caravan, disappearing during the day, then curling up in a corner of my tent at night. He'd managed to stay alive like that for 2 weeks. I didn't know how. Leo had barely enough food for himself since leaving the village. He'd given the kid a spot to sleep, but that was it. And for the past several days while I was injured and being cared for on Olivia's cart, I hadn't been in the tent at all. How had Little Mouse survived on his own? The second I stuck my head into my tent, the smell nearly killed me. Rancid hair oil, rotting leather, foot stench, mold. It was worse than a dog kennel. Way worse. I dragged every stinking piece of fur outside and sorted through the pile. Only 2 snow bear hides were still in decent shape, one big, one small. I tossed the small one to Little Mouse and said, "Come with me." She didn't move. So I grabbed her by the back of the neck, lifted her up like a kitten, and carried her down to the riverbank. It was midday, and the sun actually felt warm for once. I found a sheltered spot behind the big boulder, threw the bear hide in the water, and stomped on it. Black, filthy water oozed out, and a rainbow of grease floated to the surface. Impressive. I got Little Mouse to help me undress. My left arm was still splinted and useless. standing naked in the river, shivering. I scrubbed myself with a rag and watched layers of black grime wash away. My skin was actually several shades lighter underneath. When was the last time Leo bathed? I searched his memories. Nothing. Not a single bath on record. Scrub my back? I told Little Mouse. And I'll give you a piece of black bread. Her eyes lit up at the word, bread. She jumped straight into the freezing water and started scrubbing with everything she had. The thick crust of dried mud on her clothes dissolved into the river. That mud layer was actually her insulation, since her rags couldn't keep out the cold at all. After a few minutes, she was gasping and shaking. I looked at my reflection in the water, golden hair, strong jaw, muscular build. A proper northern barbarian body, only 17 but already built like a grown man. The original Leo had been wild, but he'd eaten well. He could smell meat cooking from across the village, and no one smoked sausage was safe. He'd hunted the local rabbits and mice nearly to extinction. Even the big predators had moved away because he'd wrecked the whole food chain. I looked at Little Mouse, dripping and filthy, and told her to wash up too while the sun was out. She just stood there. Take off your clothes. Or no bread. She slowly peeled off her shapeless rags. Underneath was a yellowed silk nightgown. She took that off too, and we stood facing each other, my muscular frame next to her skeletal one. I flexed my bicep and started bragging. Kid, I could beat 100 of you. Then I froze. Wait, where's your? I grabbed the small bear hide, wrapped her up, and blurted out the dumbest question possible. Then it hit me. Little Mouse was a girl. She just stared at me blankly and asked in a tiny voice, "Do I still get the bread?" I carried her back to camp under one arm, found Olivia, and scratched my head awkwardly. "Can you heat up some water?" Olivia sniffed me and nodded approvingly. "You already washed. What do you need hot water for? This little girl hasn't washed yet. Cold water might kill her." "Oh, so you feed her, house her, and now you're giving her hot baths too?" Quite the gentleman. Olivia huffed and turned away, but she took Little Mouse by the hand and led her toward another tent. Little Mouse tried to snuggle up to Olivia, but Olivia quietly pulled her hand free and kept her distance. Little Mouse didn't seem to mind. She just followed obediently. I couldn't follow them into the women's tent, so I headed to Uncle Urian's instead. His tent was the biggest in camp, big enough for a separate room in the back and a round table in the front with a map pinned down by a dagger. Several of the caravan's leaders sat around it while Uncle Urian gave orders. When someone's name was called, they stood and said, "Yes, sir." Nobody questioned anything. It felt like a military command tent. The more I watched Uncle Urian, the more I was convinced this man was the real main character of this story, not me. When he'd first come home from the army, he'd sized up the village's situation immediately. He spent his entire savings buying grain, recruiting militia, and forging weapons. Within weeks, he had a 50-man fighting force. After a few months of training and feeding them up, he led them to clear out nearby beast dens and drive off hostile tribes, expanding the village's safe zone. He even talked a merchant caravan into rerouting through the village so they could sell their furs, beast teeth, and herbs. But the good times didn't last. Orc scouts started raiding the area, and surrounding villages burned one by one. Uncle Urian saw the writing on the wall, staying meant dying. So he gathered refugees, expanded the militia, pulled strings from his 10 years in the army to get a pioneer charter, hunted a pack of wolves and a herd of wild bison to make jerky and warm tents, and then burned the village to the ground and led everyone south. Before torching the place, he'd sent messengers to the local Night Lord begging for help. No response, of course. When his refugee caravan showed up outside the Lord's town, the knight tossed them a cart of wheat husks and told them to get lost. With nowhere else to go, the refugees had no choice but to keep marching toward the promised land Uncle Urian kept describing. I walked into Uncle Urian's tent. He grinned when he saw me, then immediately scowled. "Is your wound healed yet? I've been watching you wander around all day. Don't test me." I flinched instinctively and clutched my chest, playing up the pain, but asked anyway. "What are you all planning? We're here now. How much more is there to figure out? You don't know a damn thing. 300 people need to eat, drink, sleep, and take a crap. Everything is something to figure out." He waved me off like a fly, then started giving orders. Valeri was to tear apart the useless carts and build fences around camp. Rashka was to burn the northern grassland clear and start plowing tomorrow. Rusev, the old shopkeeper, the only man in the village who'd regularly traveled to trade, was to go with the militia and scout for anything valuable to sell. Rusev's 2 sons had been killed in the orc raids. All he had left was a small grandson. Uncle Urian tapped the rough map on the table and grinned. I know this place. It's got everything we need. Push through the first half of the year, and the second half gets easy. Once we've got some breathing room, I'll hire a survey team. Maybe we'll find a mine and strike it rich. Nobody shared his enthusiasm. The people in this tent were the caravan's inner circle. They knew the truth better than anyone. We were broke, starving, and out of options. Everything we'd suffered on the road was just the appetizer. The old Leo would have been fired up by Uncle Urian's pep talk, dreaming about a bright future. But I wasn't the old Leo anymore. I stared at the map and thought things through. Uncle Urian had timed the migration for late winter on purpose. He wanted to arrive before the spring thaw, so we could plow enough land to plant rye by April. The soil here was rich, the climate warmer than back home. In theory, we could be self-sufficient by the first harvest. The problem was obvious. We had less than 300 people, mostly elderly, women, and children. The strong, resourceful families had all dropped out along the way, settling in comfortable towns. The ones who stayed were the weakest, the ones with no savings and no skills, clinging to Uncle Urian for survival. And between now and the rye harvest, we had to eat something for half a year. Hunting wasn't a real option. Our village had been a farming community. Most people didn't even own fishing or hunting tools. The homemade bows with bone arrowheads could barely kill a rabbit, let alone an adult elk. If we'd had proper bows, we could have driven off the kobolds with a single volley. And sending unarmed farmers into unfamiliar wilderness full of hostile tribes and wild beasts? That was suicide. While I was wrestling with all this, my eyes fell on a spearhead sitting in a crate in the corner, one of the kobold weapons collected after the last battle. I picked it up and tossed it on the table. You said you want a mine? What about iron? Iron? Uncle Urian and everyone else stared at me, confused. What iron mine? This. I pointed at the spearhead, rusted and full of air pockets from crude smelting. Where do you think the kobolds got their iron weapons? You think they bought them at a shop? Uncle Urian slapped his thigh. You're saying the kobolds found an iron deposit. It was obvious to me. Anyone who'd ever played a fantasy game knew that kobolds and mines went together like bread and butter. I'd already been thinking about the real questions. How good was or could we actually mine it? Where would we get the labor? And how would we transport and sell it? But Uncle Urian wasn't thinking about any of that. He was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. By the gods, Mondo, he yelled. You grew a brain? That set everyone off. Impossible. My pig is smarter than him. Must be that kobold he bit. Its spirit possessed him. Or maybe a demon's soul crossed over into his body. Yes, it's a soul transmigration. Has to be. I stared at them in silence. How could these people stumble onto the exact truth in 3 sentences, yet not come up with a single plan to feed themselves? So the plan changes a little, Uncle Urian said, turning the crude spearhead over in his hands. His face lit up with excitement. First we fortify the camp. Then we find the kobold nest, take it, and get that iron. Everything else can wait. Once everyone left, and it was just the 2 of us, I frowned. What good is iron right now? We can't eat iron ore. We don't have a blacksmith. There's no road for 30 miles between here and the Western Watchtower. We can't ship anything out. Shouldn't we focus on food first? I couldn't say this in front of the others. The iron discovery had just given morale a boost, and I wasn't about to crush it. You don't know anything. Just heal up, go scout, find the kobold nest, and figure out if we can take it. Uncle Urian waved me off without explaining, same as always. I shook my head and left. What I didn't see was what happened after. Olivia walking in, finding her father slumped in his chair, the confident mask gone. She pulled up his pant leg. His skin was deathly pale, covered in blackened veins running from his calf down into his boot, giving off a faint smell of rot. It's nothing, he told her. Just a little problem. I can handle it. Back at my tent, Little Mouse had already finished her bath and was hanging the washed bear hide on sticks to dry. She'd also neatly reorganized all the stinking furs I'd thrown outside, stacking them in a corner without losing a single scrap. She'd even rolled the loose hairs into a ball and saved them. She was wearing clothes Olivia had lent her, a worn wool sweater under a rough linen smock, both way too big. The hem dragged on the ground, making her stumble around like a little monk in oversized robes. Kind of funny, kind of cute. This was the first time I'd seen her clean. With her face washed, she actually looked pretty. Fair skin, delicate features, black hair, and black eyes. But she was painfully thin. Her cheeks and eye sockets were sunken from long starvation, which gave her an eerie look. Honestly, even covered in mud, it should have been obvious she was a girl. But the original Leo just didn't care about things like that. Knowing him, he probably wouldn't have cared about her species, let alone her gender. Save a mouse on a good day, cook it on a bad one. That was his style. I still had her little silk nightgown. Even after washing, it had dried on its own almost instantly. It was tiny in my hand, light as a wisp of cloud, shimmering with strange colors in the sunlight. And it was warm. I could feel heat radiating from the fabric. I'd never touched anything like it, not even in my previous life. Some kind of magic textile. This was probably what had kept Little Mouse alive through the northern winter. It meant her background was more complicated than she let on. But I had no energy for side quests right now. Survival was the main mission. Here, I stuffed the nightgown back into her hands. Wear it under your clothes. Don't let anyone see it, or someone will steal it. She clutched the silk and said nothing, head down as always. By the way, where did you sleep while I was hurt? What did you eat? She opened her mouth, stammered a bit, then managed. Olivia, sister, made me a tent. Her imperial language was surprisingly nice sounding, with an accent that definitely wasn't from the north. Leo had never left the village, so I couldn't place it. So Olivia had helped her after all, despite acting cold. That fit what I knew. In Leo's memories, Olivia was always the one who cooked the snow rabbits he caught. But she'd often refused to butcher them, especially when food was plentiful. At one point she'd accumulated 7 rabbits and a baby deer as pets. She couldn't stand watching things die, even a stray like Little Mouse. Little Mouse tucked the nightgown away, then grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the center of camp. The place was buzzing with activity. People hammering together tents, ripping planks off old carts, pounding fence posts into the ground, clearing brush and stones. The mood was lighter than anything on the road. Rows of wooden fences were going up around the perimeter, with tents built against them for shelter. If we got attacked, the fences would at least stop arrows and javelins. In the middle of camp stood the kitchen, a half-open tent stretched between 2 carts. Underneath the carts, cages held some chickens, ducks, and rabbits. 14 heads, 38 legs total. Several women were busy cooking. A group of girls had just returned from outside camp carrying baskets of wild plants. Big pots were boiling with nameless greens, beans, and bits of chopped turnip and dried meat. From a nearby tent came the smell of baking bread, though baking was generous. They were just reheating rock-hard stored bread. Those loaves were stiff enough to use as weapons. Without soaking them in hot broth first, you couldn't even cut them with a knife. Looking at all those steaming pots, you might think we had plenty of food. That was exactly the illusion Uncle Urian wanted. That's why the kitchen was in the center of camp, where everyone could see it. But I knew the truth. Those 2 carts held nearly everything we had left. Little Mouse pulled me to the side of the kitchen cart, where a dozen or so kids had already gathered. They were all skinny, ragged, hungry-looking. When they saw Little Mouse, nobody said a word to her. But when they spotted me, it was all Big Brother Leo and Captain. These kids had all been smacked around by Leo at some point, but somehow that only made them admire him more. None of them dared get as close as Little Mouse, though nobody could be sure Leo wouldn't punt them across the camp. The kids were here for their special meal. The hard bread was too rough for children, packed with bran, beans, acorn flour, and deerhorn cassava. It could bloat a small stomach dangerously. So the youngest ones got something different. After a short wait, Olivia came over with a basket. She looked surprised to see me standing among the kids, but ignored me. She unlocked the supply cart, pulled out a bundle of long bread sticks, black, lumpy things, but at least soft enough to chew, and tore each one in half, handing out a piece to every child. Then she opened her basket and announced, "Today, everyone gets a bonus egg." The kids cheered. The eggs were tiny, smaller than ping pong balls. The chickens barely laid anything in winter, and these dozen or so had been saved up over the whole journey. Olivia had originally planned to trade them for grain at a town, but since we'd passed the last town without stopping, she decided to give them to the children as a reward for making it here alive. Many of the kids were so thin they could barely stand. Little Mouse was last in line. She held her bread and stared at the egg in Olivia's hand, hesitating to reach for it. "She shouldn't get one. She's not one of us," a few kids shouted. "She's a stray. Her dad doesn't work here. She doesn't get to eat." I raised my fist and flexed. The muscles in my arm twisted like steel cables. Every kid shut up instantly. I snatched the egg from Olivia, pinched Little Mouse's cheeks to force her mouth open, and popped it in. Done. Little Mouse gently pushed me toward Olivia, offering to share her bread with me. In her mind, the kind big sister would surely feed me too. Olivia and I stared at each other. She clutched the supply cart protectively. "You're going to steal food from children now? Who says I'm not a child? How old do you think I am?" She rolled her eyes, turned around, fished out a tiny strip of wild bison jerky the size of my pinky finger, and handed it over. "Here, something nice for you." I chewed it. It tasted like tree bark. I watched her bend over the cart, digging for supplies. Olivia wore a pale yellow belted tunic and a patched cotton dress, standard village woman clothing, with a black fur wrap over her shoulders. But her figure made it all look like something out of a video game. Compared to the other rough farm women, having an imperial soldier for a father made Olivia basically village royalty. Her mother had been educated and raised her well before passing away. Olivia could read and do math, so she'd naturally become Uncle Urian's right hand, managing all the caravan's supplies and property. She'd also been the one nursing me back to health, washing me, changing bandages, spoon-feeding me porridge. I owed her my life, honestly, but in Leo's memories, they'd grown up together, and their entire relationship was built on bickering. Saying, "Thank you," was physically impossible. His childhood memories were full of bullying her until she ran home crying, and then her mother would invite him in for dinner and lecture him while he ate. Bully a girl, get a free meal, what a deal. She finally turned around and caught me staring. Her face went red. "Why are you still here?" That's it. I realized the jerky I'd already swallowed was supposed to be my treat. That tiny stick? That was bison jerky. I wouldn't even eat it myself. She looked furious, like she'd wasted kindness on a dog. It wasn't even as good as a spicy snack stick from a convenience store back home. I stormed off. Little Mouse hurried after me, clutching her bread. I reached over and tore off a big chunk, stuffing it in my mouth. She looked down at the missing piece sadly, then spat the egg out of her mouth. She'd been holding it in there the whole time, and offered it to me, trying to make up for the lost bread. I looked at the egg dripping with her saliva. Get lost. After eating the adult meal, a rock-hard bread loaf soaked in watery soup, I realized those days of porridge in the cart had actually been luxury dining. I hogged a whole cooking pot, scraping the bottom with a ladle for 10 minutes, and couldn't find a single real piece of anything. That night, I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling, turning over every scrap of knowledge from my past life and every survival trick from Leo's memories, trying to piece together a plan to feed 300 people. If only I had some kind of cheat ability, like a search engine in my brain, I thought. Hey Internet, Episode 1 of Wilderness Survival. How do I keep a bunch of old folks and kids from starving? Little Mouse crept in and curled up by my feet in her pile of ratty furs. Every few minutes she'd inch a little closer to my leg, then a little closer, then a little more. I felt the cold radiating off her tiny body. I sighed and dropped my foot onto her. She happily hugged my calf and went still. Even with her magic silk nightgown, she was freezing. Her body just didn't have enough blood or calories to produce heat. My leg felt like I'd stuck it outside the tent. It took a solid 10 minutes before my body heat warmed her up. In the darkness, her tiny voice came. "Leo, can I call you Daddy?" "Why?" They said, "If you have a daddy, you get to eat." "Fine, Daddy." "Yeah." Next morning, Little Mouse was gone. I searched the camp, asking everyone. A kid pointed toward the river. I found her crouched on a shallow gravel bank, shivering, her oversized clothes hiked up and tied at the waist, legs bare from thigh to toe. Her pale skin was covered in horrible frostbite sores. Olivia had no extra pants to lend her. She was fishing with her bare hands in the icy shallows. Finally, she cupped a tiny fish, no bigger than a finger, and her face lit up, eyes squeezing into happy little crescents. She shoved it straight into her mouth, mud and all, too afraid it would escape to bother cleaning it. The kids in camp only got one meal a day. In the mornings, they might scrounge a few bites from their parents' bowls or get a handful of boiled peas. Nobody called Little Mouse for any of that, so she had to find food on her own, saving scraps of bread or catching minnows in the freezing river. I walked up and grabbed her jaw, trying to fish the thing out of her mouth. She panicked, slurped it down whole, then covered her head expecting a beating. When she realized it was me, she hung her head guiltily. I could practically hear her thinking, "I'm sorry, I should have given the fish to Daddy first." I didn't have the heart to scold her. "Your method is too slow. Watch this." I moved some rocks around, cleared out a little pool, built a small dam, and left one gap connecting it to the river channel. "Let's go. Don't play by the river alone. Olivia will cut off your food. Come back tonight and there'll be fish." "Bread?" she asked. "What bread? You promised yesterday." I went to Olivia and shamelessly begged until she caved and slipped me one soft roll. I handed it to Little Mouse, who stared at me with worship in her eyes, calling me Daddy over and over. Breakfast for the adults was the usual: half a brick of hard bread, a mug of hot water, and a chunk of something like sweet potato crossed with a yam. It was called deerhorn cassava, a northern plant that could grow in frozen soil. More filling than bread, but mildly poisonous. Eat too much and it could kill you. After choking down that meal, I turned to the young man beside me. "Ivan, pass the word." Militia, a symbol for training. Within minutes, 20 men showed up. Some still had bandages on. That was everyone. The rest were either on guard duty or dead. Our fighters were also our main labor force. Back in the village, Uncle Urian had only been able to squeeze in training before breakfast and after dinner. The only full-time soldier had been Leo, since he'd never farmed a day in his life. Most of the others had originally joined the militia because Uncle Urian offered an extra pound of bread per day, a huge deal when many farmers couldn't even guarantee that much food in winter. But after surviving this migration, every one of these men understood what armed strength meant in the wilderness. When I called, they came immediately, even the wounded. They looked like a band of Russian fur trappers from the Tsarist era, half of them wearing crude armor stitched together from animal hides, all of them noticeably bulkier than the regular villagers after a year of extra rations and training. I'd been promoted to militia captain halfway through the journey, after the previous captain left when his wife and kids got sick. I'd never actually led a training session before, but I had my own ideas about combat, ideas shaped by being a transmigrator. Close quarters brawling was too brutal, too ugly. I'd already been bitten to death by a kobold once. The original Leo's battle-crazy instincts kept pushing me toward charging in headfirst, but my modern soul wanted something more elegant. Ranged attacks. That was the way. Unfortunately, our village wasn't a hunting community. These were farmers. They couldn't shoot a bow to save their lives, literally. Our homemade bows with bone arrowheads couldn't even kill a deer. But these guys were tough, strong, and had thick skin. I could work with that. Starting today, I announced, we're practicing javelin throwing. My requirements are simple: 50 yards without the spear hitting the ground, and at 20 yards, 5 hits out of 10. Anyone who fails gets their dinner cut in half. The men exchanged confused looks. A brown-haired young man named Vicky spoke up. "But we're supposed to be plowing fields, right? Uncle Urian said we need 300 acres cleared in 3 months, or we'll miss the spring planting." I paused. How big is 1 acre? Every single militiaman stared at me in disbelief, then open contempt. Even the illiterate ones were stunned by their captain's ignorance. "You grew up in a farming village. How do you not know how big an acre is?" I stared back at them, equally frustrated. How was I supposed to know their measurement system? Was it an English acre? A metric hectare? Some local unit? The original Leo had never touched a plow in his life. He didn't even have a basic concept of land area stored in that muscle-filled head of his. One of the militiamen showed me roughly how big an acre was in this world, about the same as an English acre back home, or half a soccer field. 300 acres in 3 months, with no machines, using mostly old folks and women? That sounded insane. And even if we pulled it off, the math was depressing. This far north, they could only grow one season of rye per year. Plant 200 pounds of seed per acre, harvest 800. After setting aside next year's seed, 1 acre barely kept one person alive. 300 acres for 300 people meant zero margin. No taxes, no surplus, no comfort. Just not starving. But I wasn't the type to sit around doing math and worrying. It just made me angry. So I did what Leo would do. I don't care about plowing right now. We train first. Anyone who tries to leave gets a beating. Nobody argued. They might not respect a 17-year-old captain, but they definitely feared his fists. Besides, the memory of cobalt javelins raining down and killing a dozen of their friends was still fresh. That volley had been the deadliest ranged attack we'd suffered on the entire journey, second only to orc throwing axes and troll hunting spears. These men understood what projectile weapons could do. We marched to an open area outside camp. I drew a line in the dirt and pointed at a hillside about 20 meters away, dotted with small trees. Hit a trunk. That counts as a successful throw. One eager militiaman stepped up, wound back, and hurled a spear with everything he had. It wobbled through the air and landed in the dirt several meters short. Everyone laughed and rushed to try. Most throws didn't even reach the trees. One spear got lucky and stuck in a trunk near the roots. Pathetic results. But I wasn't disappointed. In my previous life as an athletics student, I knew that untrained people with no run-up, throwing mismatched weapons ranging from half a kilo to 3 kilos, some of them literally pitchforks, would perform exactly like this. Spears flying sideways, spinning, skipping off the ground like stones on water. I'd seen it all before. After letting them throw 2 rounds to get it out of their systems, I started demonstrating proper technique. Grip, arm mechanics, throwing with and without a run-up, release angle. I held a spear level above my shoulder, took a slow run-up of a few steps, and launched it. The javelin traced a beautiful, stable arc through the air, sailed past 20 meters, and punched clean through a tree trunk, the tip poking out the other side. Perfect. Years of sports training in my past life, combined with this body's raw power, made javelin throwing feel like breathing. And this was with broken ribs and a busted arm still healing. In peak condition, this body could probably compete in multiple Olympic events. The militia stared in stunned silence, then started whispering among themselves. Who's the best javelin thrower here? The guy who's never thrown one before? Or the kobold chief he bit to death? The real answer, as they'd say, soul transmigration. After about an hour of practice, the men were getting the hang of it. With proper form, even without a run-up, these strong farmhands could already throw 30 meters. Their accuracy was terrible, but that would come with time and standardized weapons. Morning training is over, I announced. Barely acceptable. From now on, javelin practice every morning, at least 1 hour. No exceptions. Uncle Urian had wandered over to watch. He slapped my injured shoulder with a grin. Didn't know you had this in you, kid. Ow, ow, ow. I ducked away from his giant hand. I figured it out while hunting. Good, good. This'll help a lot when we go after the kobolds. Don't rush it, I said, grinning. I've got plenty more tricks up my sleeve. Huh? Like I don't know exactly how many tricks you have? He raised his boot to kick me. If you're this cheerful, your wounds must be healed. Get to the fields and start plowing. After training, the militia hurried off to join the plowing crews on the northern grassland. They were the main workforce, and farming was what they actually knew how to do. Uncle Urian had promised that in the second year, every adult man would get 1 acre of permanent tax-free land, unheard of anywhere else in the empire. Down south, the feudal estate system had wiped out independent farmers entirely. Only out here on the empty frontier did free farmers still exist. I tagged along and squatted on a rotten tree stump to watch. Over 100 people were out there swinging hoes, shovels, and pickaxes, turning the charred earth one chunk at a time. The old folks and women followed behind, hauling away rocks and burning piles of roots. They'd already turned several acres in one morning. The soil here was incredible, soft, rich, and so much easier to work than the frozen ground back home, where you needed a pickaxe just to crack the frost in spring. Moving 1,000 miles southwest had been like jumping from Siberia to somewhere temperate. But the longer I watched, the more something bugged me. Then it hit me like a slap. "Where are the donkeys?" I shouted. Why aren't you using donkeys to plow? The donkeys. The Padova kids took them out to graze. Why aren't they pulling plows? The whole field burst out laughing. Have donkeys plow? Why not teach them magic while you're at it? I spun toward Uncle Urian. You've never seen animals pulling a plow? I'd meant to say plow, but the word didn't exist in Leo's vocabulary. His brain had literally never encountered the concept. Uncle Urian stroked his beard thoughtfully. I suppose animals could work the soil, but wouldn't that require some kind of magic? I didn't bother arguing. I stomped back to camp, cursing under my breath. Farmers without a plow. This was like a modern person who'd never seen a phone. The plow existed thousands of years ago in the most primitive civilizations. How could medieval farmers not have one? Turns out, the answer was geography. Down in the empire's wealthy southern provinces, they had heavy 2-horse and 4-horse plows, producing 3 times the grain of the north. But up here along the frozen border, the local lords didn't care about farming. Their money came from livestock, for trading, and lumber. The grain they taxed from peasants just fed their horses. No noble wanted to live this far north. They hired managers and stayed in warmer regions south of the Anzino River. Leo's old village had been one of the few farming settlements near the North Ice River. Before Uncle Urian came home from the army, many families didn't even own an iron hoe, let alone a draft animal. Over a third of their food came from foraging: acorns, mushrooms, wild greens, and that mildly poisonous deerhorn cassava. Back at camp, I barged past Olivia's protests, grabbed her family's best pointed shovel, and smashed it into shape. I cut a few curved branches, trimmed and nailed them together into a frame, then mounted the bent shovel blade at the bottom as a plowshare. A crude curved beam plow. Simple, ugly, but functional. I looked at my creation with deep satisfaction. First week after transmigrating, and I'd invented the plow. I carried it back to the field and had Olivia bring a donkey. I tied the pulling rope to the plow, set the blade, and yelled, "Let's go." The donkey didn't move. Olivia figured out what I was trying to do, smiled, and took the reins. She pulled the donkey forward while I held the plow steady, pressing the blade into the soil. The ground here was so soft, just dead grass roots and a few pebbles, that the donkey barely strained. A foot-deep furrow appeared behind us like magic. The villagers hadn't paid me any attention at first. In their eyes, Leo was a brainless fighter who'd never touched farmland. But when I casually outpaced the sweating militiamen in minutes, everyone stopped to stare. Uncle Urian's eyes went wide. He was so excited he switched to formal imperial speech. "I've seen this before. It looks familiar." So familiar, he had, actually, glimpsed real plows once during a military march through the south. He just never connected it to his own people's farming. Within the hour, Uncle Urian had the village's best woodworkers building plows under my direction. We cranked out 18 of them and hitched every donkey in camp. Suddenly, the fields were being turned 3 times faster than before. I sat back down on my stump, watching the villagers plow with new energy, and somewhere deep in my mind, I could almost hear a notification chime. "You have unlocked animal-drawn plow technology. Farmer productivity 1. Grain output 1. The curve beam plow was dead simple to use. I'd left out all the fancy parts. You just pushed or lifted the handle to control how deep the blade cut. After a few words of instruction, even kids and women could operate it. That freed up all the men. The fields were now run by women steering the plows, children leading the donkeys, and old folks picking out rocks and roots behind them. The blackened wasteland was turning into farmland at incredible speed. The men moved to the western slopes to dig irrigation ditches, at least 5 feet deep, connecting the swamps and small lakes to regulate water for the fields. Even though Uncle Urian had picked the flattest land on the peninsula, the natural terrain still had bumps, dips, and boggy patches that needed leveling or draining. And before summer, we'd need to build a small dam along the riverbank to stop floodwaters from drowning the crops. That explained why this rich peninsula grew only grass and no trees. It flooded every year. I couldn't do heavy labor with my injuries, but I wasn't idle. While watching the plowing, I sat and twisted hemp fibers into rope. Leo's years as a half-wild survivalist had maxed out his outdoor skills. The guy could strip tree bark with his bare hands and braid a snare strong enough to hang a wild boar. But his technique was pure brute force, needing a knot every meter to keep the rope from falling apart. With my transmigrator knowledge guiding his hands, I could now weave rope as thin as a chopstick that was stronger than his old finger-thick cords. What I made was a sling, a cord about a meter long with a small net pouch in the middle, one end braided into a wheat ear shape, the other into a loop. I slipped the loop over my index finger, grabbed the other end, loaded an egg-sized river stone into the pouch, and started spinning. As the sling whipped faster and faster overhead, I released. The stone shot across the wide gravel bank and splashed into the Anzino River dozens of meters away. The sling, ancient wisdom at its finest, still legendary even in the modern world. Olivia and Little Mouse helped me twist hemp. Olivia's slings came out nearly identical to mine. Little Mouse's looked like a giant centipede, couldn't even straighten the thing out. I cranked out over 30 slings, then called the militia down to the riverbank for afternoon training. I handed one to each man and demonstrated the technique. Like the javelin, the sling was easy to learn and hit harder than our pathetic homemade bows with bone arrows. Against unarmored small targets like kobolds or goblins, it would be devastating. The big weakness was accuracy. When the militia first tried, most couldn't even launch a stone forward. Pebbles flew in every direction. Don't use force. Swing gently. Release when the stone reaches the front. What are you doing? You think you're a catapult? I kicked one guy who was trying to load a rock the size of a shot put into his sling pouch. Most men eventually got their stones into the river. A few wild ones sent pebbles flying everywhere. One stone came screaming straight at my forehead from behind. Direct hit. Stars exploded in my vision. I pressed the growing lump on my head and stared at the guilty militiamen in disbelief. How do you manage a 15-meter blind shot with your back turned and nail a perfect headshot? Over the next hour, they practiced both the horizontal and vertical spinning techniques, the vertical one being the method ancient Greek heavy slingers used. Once they got comfortable, I let them gradually increase power and stone size, working up to goose egg-sized rocks. At that weight, the sling started showing its terrifying potential. Nobody here could throw a rock that size 50 meters by hand, but with a sling, it was effortless. I'd been too cautious to start with big stones. One misfire at that weight meant broken bones. The men loved it. Compared to back-breaking ditch digging, sling practice felt like playing a game. But they could also feel the power behind every throw. Little Mouse had grabbed a sling too and was practicing quietly off to the side. She was too small and weak to throw anything heavy or far, but her aim was shockingly good. Every stone landed in a tight cluster. Watching my militia spread across the riverbank, happily whipping stones into the water, I felt a surge of confidence. One invention a day. I refused to believe I couldn't keep these people alive. Once the militia got the hang of their slings, I grabbed Little Mouse and headed upstream to check my fish trap from that morning. We got there. She circled the little pool twice, scanning the clear, shallow water. Then she stared at me. Where are the fish? Yeah, where are my fish? The pool was completely empty. Not a single minnow. Little Mouse's disappointed little face made me blush. This worked on TV every time. I thought for a moment, then looked at her. She instinctively stepped back, but too late. I scooped her up under one arm and fished a small piece of bread from her pocket. Her secret stash, saved for tomorrow's breakfast. She stood there wringing her hands, expecting a beating but not resisting at all. Relax, I'll pay you back double. I crumbled the bread into the pool as bait. Come on, let's go eat. Olivia says there's thick stew tonight. I'll grab you a huge bowl. Back at camp, sunset brought everyone streaming in from the fields. 3 big pots bubbled over the kitchen fires, filling the air with the best smell we'd had in weeks. I swiped 2 big clay bowls from Olivia's cart and planted myself in front of the pot. The villagers parted around me, and the woman with the ladle handed it over without a word. I noticed their looks had changed, less annoyance, more awe and suspicion. Whispers drifted through the crowd. Soul transmigration. It's soul transmigration. I ignored them and focused on fishing through the pot for the good stuff. The stew was really more of a porridge, hulled grain mixed with pickled greens, turnips, acorns, peas, dried mushrooms, and 1 snow rabbit a scout had caught, all simmered for an entire afternoon. It looked exactly like the slop my relatives used to cook for their pigs back in the 90s. But for people who'd been chewing rock-hard bread for weeks, this was a feast. It felt like a holiday dinner. In Leo's memories, the village had an ancient tradition of communal cooking that went back to the old clan days. Every harsh winter, the village headman would drag a big pot into the center of town, fill it with snow melt, and throw in whatever food he had. Every household head would add something, anything, however small. When the pot was full and cooked, everyone ate. It wasn't just mutual aid. It also let the headman count how many families had frozen to death that week. Little Leo used to live for those pot days. It meant he didn't have to beg or catch mice in the snow. When he got older, he didn't need it anymore. He'd become the village's best hunter, and plenty of families survived winter because he'd tossed them a rabbit or a deer leg now and then. He wasn't the only one in this camp who might call him daddy. Now, with everyone's personal food gone, Uncle Urian had made the communal pot a daily thing. The remaining families had quietly handed their last savings to Olivia to manage. We'd walk back to a primitive communal society, 300 people sharing everything. While eating, I bragged to Little Mouse about foods from my previous life. Ever seen a pie as big as a millstone? Covered in almonds, walnuts, raisins, drizzled with cream. One bite, and the juices explode in your mouth. And roast suckling pig. Crispy skin, meat so tender it falls off the bone. She held her enormous bowl with both hands, listening slack-jawed, drool running down her chin. After dinner, I grabbed Little Mouse and a big wooden bucket, and we hurried back to the fish pool in the fading light. This time splashing. The pool was alive with movement. I lunged forward, blocked the gap to the river, and one big fish leaped right over my arm and escaped. But the rest were trapped. Catch the fish. Catch the fish. I jumped in, grabbed a thrashing fish as big as my forearm, and nearly cried. Finally, real meat. Uncle Urian was right. Fish you could grab with your bare hands. Catch the fish. Little Mouse jumped in too, and immediately sat down hard in the shallows, throwing up a mouthful of stew. She'd eaten too much, too fast, licked her bowl clean, and stuffed herself right to her throat. She stared at the vomit slowly drifting into the water, clearly considering whether to eat it again. I smacked the back of her head. Catch the fish. They're escaping. The little dam wasn't high enough, and panicked fish were jumping back into the river. No time for elegance. Every fish I caught, I smashed on a rock. Little Mouse splashed around uselessly, then gave up and climbed ashore to collect the dead fish into the bucket. A full bucket of fish. Walking back, I warned her. Tomorrow I'll make you grilled fish and fresh fish soup. Do not eat raw fish. Understood. That night, half asleep, I heard her mumbling. Daddy, are we eating grilled fish tomorrow? Grilled fish. Daddy, are we having fish soup? Fish soup. Daddy, is roast suckling pig yummy? I was about to snap at her when I felt a tiny bite on my calf. She was fast asleep, talking in her dreams. Before dawn, Little Mouse shook me awake. Her sleeves were soaked and her hands were blue. She'd already gone to the fish pool by herself. Go catch fish. So many fish. I grabbed a spear and a bucket and we ran. The pool was packed, black fish backs crammed together, cracking the thin ice at the edges. I jabbed the spear in and pulled up a sturgeon that must have weighed 4 or 5 pounds. The wild fish thrashed so hard it ripped free of the spear and flopped across the gravel. Little Mouse pounced on it with a battle cry and wrestled it on the ground. I waved over some patrol guards, and we hauled out everything. A few dozen pounds total. Not enough to feed 300 people, but combined with yesterday's catch, enough to improve the meal. And this method was basically like scooping fish from a market tank. Almost no effort. I had the fish sent back to camp, then built 7 or 8 more pools along the riverbank with baits sprinkled in each. No guarantee every trap would work this well, but it was more hope than we'd had before. While I was stacking rocks, a horn blast echoed from the western forest. The alarm. Seconds later, the camp horn answered. Women and children scrambled behind the riverside fence. Militia ripped down tents along the other fences to create open fighting ground. I snatched up Little Mouse and sprinted for camp. From the tree line on the western edge of the peninsula, kobold figures were pouring out, more than last time. But they looked weaker, more disorganized. Only some carried proper spears. The rest had small pickaxes, sticks, sharpened rocks, or nothing at all. Behind the fighters came a trailing mob of undersized young kobolds and slow old ones, falling behind, dropping to all fours to keep up, crashing into each other. It was almost comical. Luckily, the peninsula was wide. Nearly 1,000 meters of open ground between the forest and our camp, half of it already burned black and flat. No chance of a sneak attack. "Form up," I shouted. Uncle Urian climbed onto a cart with a bow and a few archers, calling out to calm the villagers. A group of civilian men lined up behind the fence on our flanks, gripping hoes and pitchforks. 20 militia stood in a spread-out line, 2 javelins planted in the ground beside each man, shields in one hand, slings in the other, stones loaded. My blood was pumping. The original Leo's battle-crazy instinct screamed at me to charge out there alone. The modern part of me held firm. At 100 meters, I started swinging my sling. Ready. Throw. Stones arced out and scattered across the ground. Most missed. A few kobolds went down. One stayed down with a caved-in skull, while others staggered up only to get bowled over by the mob behind them. One kobold took a stone to the head that left a visible dent, and it still got back up. These things were tougher than humans. I wasn't disappointed. One day of sling training was never going to win a battle, but the volley disrupted their already messy charge and slowed them down. The kobolds tried throwing back, stones and spears, but most fell short of our line. Meanwhile, Uncle Urian and his archers on the cart picked off several kobolds from above. Javelins ready. Throw. 20 javelins flew. 7 or 8 kobolds were skewered on the spot. Javelins. Throw. 2 volleys later, the survivors reached 10 meters out. Shield wall. The militia snapped together. 20-round shields locked tight, short spears and sword tips poking through the gaps. The biggest kobold warrior at the front leaped into the air, fangs bared, drool flying, trying to vault the wall. Die. I roared from the center and hurled the chain hammer like a slingshot with everything I had. The heavy iron head hit the airborne kobold square in the face. Its body spun a full rotation midair before crashing down. Its head was paste. The remaining kobolds saw the shield wall, the armed civilians on the flanks, and their champion's exploded skull. A chorus of pitiful whimpering broke out. They crashed into each other trying to turn around, tangled into a heap, and fled. Without a chief to hold them, they broke even faster than I'd expected. Classic kobold nature: bully the weak, run from the strong. I let out a long breath. We were critically short on fighters. Driving them off without a single casualty was the best outcome I could have hoped for. Kobolds were technically intelligent creatures, but only barely. Their animal instincts overpowered everything. Without a strong leader forcing them forward, they'd flee the moment things went bad. Just like a wolf pack without an alpha, except even easier to scatter. That's why kobolds, goblins, fishmen, and other small races were so easily enslaved by stronger species. What's wrong with these kobolds? Uncle Urian walked over, staring at the 20-something corpses scattered outside camp. This week, and they still attacked. Think about it, I said. Big ones, small ones, all of them. They came out in full force. That means we're sitting right on their doorstep. They're desperate. I watched the last of them vanish into the forest and made up my mind. Let's eat fast, then chase them down and finish this. Uncle Urian looked me over. That urgent? Are your wounds even healed? I pressed my aching chest and flexed my stiff arm. Can't afford to wait. Kobolds aren't the only thing out here. This time it was them. What comes next? He sighed. You're right. Too much to do, and none of it can wait. I'm pulling half the workers off plowing today to start cutting timber. We need real buildings and proper walls. If we can't clear 300 acres, we'll do half. Staying alive comes first. He looked at me with something like pride. You've finally grown up. At least you've got a brain now. When I get my Pioneer Knight title, you'll be my first squire. A squire? After everything I've done? That's insulting, he glared. What? You want to be the knight while I carry your sword? The villagers barely flinched at the attack. They'd gotten used to kobold raids. This time nobody died, which actually boosted morale. The wilderness suddenly felt a little less terrifying. At the kitchen, fish were being cleaned and thrown into the big pot. I reached for a nice one to grill for myself, and Olivia smacked my hand. She planted herself on top of the fish bucket, spread her skirt over a second bucket like a mother hen guarding her eggs, and glared at me. What do you think you're doing? I caught these fish. Yours or not, they go to everyone. Today it's fish soup for all, just one fish. No, I switched tactics, letting my face go somber. After breakfast, I'm heading out to attack the kobold nest. I might not come back. This could be my last meal. She froze. In that split second, my hand shot under her skirt into the bucket and snatched a fish. Unfortunately, in the rush, I only grabbed a tiny one, barely palm-sized. I walked off holding my little fish like a triumphant war hero, little mouse trotting behind me with stars in her eyes. We grilled it together. After breakfast, I assembled the strike force, 25 militia and 25 civilian volunteers, 50 men total. Uncle Urian stayed behind with the rest to guard camp. 2 scouts led us west, following the trail the kobolds had left in the thick carpet of dead leaves on the forest floor. Our fighting strength broke down like this, using the old Imperial Army rankings. Me as a Tier 3 soldier, equivalent to a heavy elite infantry, leading 5 Tier 2 regulars, 20 Tier 1 conscripts, and 25 armed farmers. The Empire had once maintained a professional military with 4 tiers of infantry. Tier 1 conscripts got iron-lined leather armor, a wooden shield, and an iron sword. Tier 2 regulars earned chainmail, a reinforced shield, and a proper blade after 3 years of service. Tier 3 heavy elites wore steel plate components on top of all that. 100 pounds of armor that only the strongest soldiers could fight in. Centuries ago, entire regiments of these heavy infantry had stood against cavalry charges and orc battle lines. Uncle Urian had been Tier 4, an Imperial Sergeant, the highest rank a commoner could reach, just below noble knights. Our only problem? Nobody's equipment met standard. Most of us carried farming tools, homemade shields, and scavenged kobold weapons. Our real combat effectiveness was cut in half. The forest south of the river was all bare deciduous trees, skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky, eerie in winter. The kobold's path was obvious in the thick leaf litter. I didn't really believe kobolds were smart enough to set an ambush, but I sent our best veterans ahead as scouts anyway, just in case. A few miles through the forest, the ground turned rocky and the trees shrank to scrubby bushes. The Grand Barrier loomed ahead, its waterfalls pouring from the clouds. We followed a stream uphill for another mile and found the Kobold Valley. No wonder they'd been attacking us so often. We'd built our camp practically on their doorstep. It was a small valley carved into the hillside, with a stream running down the middle. The kobolds had built ramshackle shacks along both slopes, some just roofs covering cave entrances in the rock. The whole cliff face was honeycombed with mining tunnels. Piles of ore and slag choked the stream in several places, killing all the vegetation along its banks. They knew we were coming. By the time we entered the valley, the kobolds were already gathered on the flat ground in the center, at least 100 that could fight, plus babies rolling around everywhere. A black and white furred kobold was barking orders, trying to organize them. I wasn't worried. I could see the fear in their eyes. After throwing their strongest warriors at us again and again, this tribe had burned through its best fighters. The ones left were mostly old and weak. To them, our line of men averaging 6 feet tall must have looked like apex predators. Form up, 25 militia advanced behind their big round shields, with me in the center. 25 armed civilians followed with sickles and pitchforks. Our northerners might have been raised on gruel, but good genes had made them tall and broad. With fur armor and oversized shields, they looked like they could flatten a kobold with one swing. The kobolds panicked and threw stones and spears, but nothing got through the shield wall. Without 100 javelins launched at once, they couldn't hurt us. Javelins ready. Throw. 2 volleys. The kobolds broke and scattered, leaving their dead behind. I held position. No chasing. We picked up our javelins and reformed. Minutes later, the black and white kobold howled them back. Most of them returned, huddling together, blocking the path again. They couldn't run. Behind them were their winter food stores and their pups. Something stirred in me. This kobold tribe wasn't so different from my own village. We'd faced orc raiders we couldn't beat. We'd lined up our militia knowing they'd die, just to buy time. In the end, we'd had to abandon everything and flee. And we'd been the lucky ones. Other villages were slaughtered to the last person. On the road, we'd passed refugee groups of over 100 people frozen solid after a single night of blizzard, because they didn't have a leader like Uncle Urian to prepare supplies and shelter. But I couldn't afford sympathy. Other hostile tribes surrounded us. If I left these kobolds alone, they might stab us in the back the next time something worse attacked our camp. Javelins ready. Then the black and white kobold stepped forward. It walked into the open space between our lines, hands raised, making gurgling sounds. "Is it challenging us to a duel?" one of my men whispered. I waved the militia down and stepped out alone. The kobold stared at the chain hammer in my hand, the one I'd taken from their dead chief, and its gurgling broke into choppy words. "Surrender. You. Surrender." Imperial language. Broken, mixed with kobold speech, but I could understand it. "You can talk?" I moved closer, stunned. "Kingur. You. We. Surrender." Half gibberish, half real words. Communication was barely possible, but it was more than I'd expected. "Food. Woof. You. Gur. Iron. We. Leave." Other kobolds grew agitated, barking. The black and white one snarled them quiet. Several kobolds dragged sacks from the mine tunnels and dropped them between our lines. The leader opened one. Acorns and pine nuts spilled across the ground. It pointed at the sacks, then at the valley behind it. "Food. Iron. Yours. Give us. We. Leave." I listened twice before I understood. They were offering us their food stores and the iron mine. In exchange, we let them go. I stood there, thinking. The black and white kobold standing before me looked like an upright husky, kind of goofy, actually. When they weren't baring their fangs, most kobolds resembled golden retrievers. Only the muscular ugly ones looked like pit bulls. They were dog-headed people, after all, not boar men or hyena men. I thought for a moment, smiled, and said firmly, "No deal." The husky's fangs came out. The golden retrievers and pit bulls behind it started barking. I quickly added, "We don't want your food. We don't want your home. We're a peaceful people." The husky paused, confused. "We. Not believe. Smile. Cunning. Humans. Cunning. Your common tongue. Very bad." I straightened my face. "Trust us. We're peaceful. We can trade your iron for our grain. Your home stays your home." The husky hesitated, looking back at its tribe. The Goldens stood frozen. A few pit bulls kept growling, ready to fight. I leaned forward, tapped the artery on my neck, and stared them down. They glanced at my neck, then at the chain hammer on my belt, the one I'd taken from their dead chief, and whimpered, shrinking back into the crowd. They couldn't beat this, peaceful, human. Since words alone weren't working, I turned to my men. "Hand over all your rations." Uncle Urian had packed 2 days of food per man, just in case. 50 people's worth of hard bread and dried supplies made a decent pile. I dumped it all next to the kobold's acorns. The moment bread hit the ground, I heard swallowing sounds ripple through the kobold ranks. "We trade food for iron. We can live in peace. You've seen us. We just want to farm. We don't want to fight. You. Farm. We. Iron." The husky went quiet, thinking. Just as it was about to agree, I added, "One small condition. Woof, send at least 20 pups to our camp to learn our language. Communication keeps the peace." Its fangs came out again. "Humans. Cunning. We. Leave. Kobolds. Never slaves. Woof. Free food and housing included. Adults can come too. No limit on numbers. Free to leave anytime." Every kobold's eyes lit up like golden retrievers spotting a treat. "If you can't accept, then I'm afraid you'll have to leave this valley." After huddled whispers, they agreed. It made sense from their side. Kobolds bred fast, 4 or 5 pups per litter, fully grown in 3 years. This little tribe had lived here for generations, surviving on small game, fish, acorns from the oak forests, and pine nuts from across the river. They had zero long-term planning. In summer and fall they'd mine and smith happily. In winter, they'd huddle in caves watching their pups starve to death. When our caravan moved into their foraging territory, conflict was inevitable. Now, as the losing side, they'd expected to be slaughtered or driven out, sending 20 pups as hostages who'd get fed for free. That was a bargain. Trading iron for grain meant they could stop foraging and just mine all day, their dream life. Centuries ago, kobolds had been vassal subjects of the northern beast races, with real culture, shamanic traditions, even a kobold city. After the empire crushed the beast races and drove them north, kobold civilization collapsed. The survivors scattered into tiny forest tribes and regressed to primitive existence. Deep down, they'd always wanted to serve a stronger power again, just to have food and the freedom to dig. Kobolds never slaves was a nice slogan. Reality was different. The husky led 9 adult goldens and 20 fuzzy pups back toward our camp with us. Half the kobolds actually knew a few words of Imperial, but only their new chief had the courage to visit a human settlement. 20 of my civilian volunteers shouldered 10 baskets of iron ingots and 10 baskets of raw ore. The ingots were really sponge iron, ugly, spongy black lumps full of impurities, made through primitive pit smelting. But they were soft enough to forge. The husky explained that one lump could be hammered into a spearhead or pickaxe head after 10 days of work. Every adult kobold got a small iron pick for mining, and every warrior got a hunting spear, the same javelins we'd been using. Crude as it was, this iron was a serious asset in the wilderness. It let the kobolds hunt, chop wood, dig ore, and defend themselves. I looked at the baskets of iron and the sacks of dried nuts. Then something caught my eye. Where did you get these woven baskets and linen sacks? These kobolds had primitive iron smelting, but nothing else. They didn't even wear clothes. Yet they had nicely woven willow baskets and decent linen sacks. Even the women in our village couldn't weave this well. No way the kobolds made these themselves. I stared at the husky. She stared back, mouth hanging open, saying nothing. That confirmed my suspicion. This was exactly why I hadn't wanted to simply drive the kobolds away. Wiping them out would cost us casualties we couldn't afford. 100 desperate kobolds fighting for their home was basically 100 organized wolves. Chasing them off was no better. They might ally with other tribes and come back, or turn into guerrillas picking off our people one by one. The best approach was the ancient Chinese strategy: win them over through diplomacy and trade. And sure enough, barely an hour into our new alliance, one small detail exposed a secret. Where did these baskets and sacks come from? I pressed. The husky swallowed hard and finally managed one word I understood: wild folk. That word made me tense up. In this world, wild folk was the opposite of subjects, people who refused to pay taxes or serve any lord and got no protection in return. The polite term was wild folk. Everyone else called them bandits, robbers, raiders. Centuries ago, when the northern clans joined the empire, the big chieftains became counts and dukes. But plenty of smaller clan leaders refused to give up their independence. They fled into the mountains and forests, raiding noble territory for generations. Over the centuries, most disappeared, and the word, wild folk, became slang for any outlaw living in the wilderness. So there were human outlaws nearby, trading with the kobolds. Not great news for our settlement. It also explained why this husky could speak Imperial and was smart enough to negotiate. She'd dealt with humans before. Much cleverer than the previous chief I'd bitten to death. Peaceful, the husky insisted. Wild folk. Kind. Trade. We. Peaceful people. How peaceful? I asked. Peaceful. Iron. Trade. Baskets, sacks. Food. Very little. Where are they? How many? After a long silence, she pointed toward the distant waterfall. Lake. Kind. Peaceful people. Back at camp, I parked the kobolds in an open area with 20 militia standing guard, then dragged the husky into Uncle Urian's tent for a meeting with the leadership. When the husky explained the trade terms she'd had with the wild folk, the room erupted. 1 basket for a whole basket of iron ore, 1 linen sack for a full sack of iron ingots. That's what you call kind. Cruel. Ruthless. I feel sorry for the kobolds. Uncle Urian was furious. He glared at the husky. Those swindlers. Never trade with them again. Whatever they offered, we'll pay double. The other leaders nodded in righteous agreement. But the husky got nervous and backed toward the door. Woof. Humans. Cunning. We. Leave. Wait. I said quickly. Name your price. We'll negotiate. The husky had clearly rehearsed this on the walkover. In remarkably clear Imperial, she laid out her terms. Trade. Same as wild folk. Grain, 1 sack. Or 5 sacks. You. Not in her mountain. Oak forest. Half. For us. Deal. Uncle Urian slammed the table and reached for a handshake. 1 sack of grain for 5 sacks of ore. Half the western oak forest is yours. No takebacks. The husky eyed him suspiciously, then looked at me. Deal, I confirmed. No takebacks. She glanced at the chain hammer on my belt. No takebacks. We. Peaceful people. The mood in the tent turned cheerful. Then one of the leaders squinted at the husky. You're female, aren't you? No males left in your tribe? I, chief. Chief's daughter. Princess. Another leader pointed at me, laughing. Why not seal the alliance with a marriage? Leo, marry the kobold princess. You'll have bragging rights forever. The tent roared with laughter until Uncle Yuri Yin slammed his fist down. Shut up. Show some respect. She's an ally. A neighbor. Understand? Everyone went quiet, including me. When Uncle Yuri Yin turned on the military authority, even I flinched. The husky had nearly bolted out the tent door, but she recovered, and her tail started wagging softly. Neighbor. Outside, I smiled at her. My name is Leo. What's yours? Fisha. Fisha Inuit. So you're the chief now? The last chief was. I stopped mid-sentence. Dead, Fisha said in perfectly clear Imperial, staring straight at me. Bitten to death. When 10 sacks of rye were laid out in front of Fisha, her tail started wagging so fast it blurred. The other 9 Goldens did the same. Uncle Yuri Yin pointed at the grain, then at the pile of sponge iron. These 10 sacks for your 20 baskets of iron and ore. The extra is our apology gift for the fighting. From now on, skip the ingots, just bring raw ore. 5 sacks of ore for 1 sack of grain. Including the sack, the Goldens wagged even harder. Humans were so generous. To the kobolds, iron ore was basically gravel. Their minds were overflowing with it. They dug for fun, searching for shinies, and tossed the iron aside as waste. Only the best pieces went to their smiths. But the finished sponge iron actually cost them enormous time and labor, so they were relieved we only wanted raw ore. Food, on the other hand, was priceless to any tribe. And the linen sacks? Pure luxury. Kobolds couldn't grow or weave linen. When a sack wore out, they'd cut it into clothing, blankets, curtains, even mating decorations. Linen sacks were their Louis Vuitton. Uncle Yuri Yin had spotted immediately that the crude sponge iron wasn't worth much to human blacksmiths. They'd have to reprocess the whole mess. But the raw red iron ore was decent quality, steady supply, and easy to sell. 1 sack of rye weighed under 50 pounds. 1 same-size sack of ore weighed over 200. Do the math. 1 sack of grain bought 1,000 pounds of iron ore. Fisha even volunteered to have her kobolds handle delivery. It was like money falling from the sky. Several of the leaders watched the celebrating kobolds with guilt in their eyes. Were we robbing these poor creatures? Fisha led her Goldens home with the grain, so happy they forgot the 20 pups they'd left behind. The little furballs stood there staring after their parents, abandoned. Can we afford this? I asked Uncle Yuri Yin quietly. We only had 2 carts of food left, and 10 sacks was a serious chunk. Don't worry. Tomorrow I'm heading to town to sell the ore through some old army buddies. He grinned. I know people. Trust me. I glanced toward the distant waterfall. The wild folk were still out there. They, peaceful people. Soon, whistles came from the western forest. A line of kobolds emerged carrying baskets of or on their backs. About 20 with baskets, the rest balancing head-sized rocks on top of their skulls. They stopped at the tree line, growling nervously as our people approached. Can't blame them. We'd killed their warriors and chief not long ago. Under Fish's direction, they carefully filled 5 linen sacks with, or, about 1,000 pounds total, everything they'd brought. Then 20 pairs of big, shiny dog eyes locked onto me, full of hope. I walked over and dropped 1 sack of rye at Fish's feet. 2 kobolds grabbed it, sniffing and inspecting. Then they yipped to the others. The whole group erupted in howls and whimpers, like they'd won a war. Grain. Real grain. This tribe had lost all farming knowledge. They survived on acorns, pine nuts, wild seeds, and whatever they could scavenge. Rye was the lowest quality grain humans grew, but the kobolds didn't know or care. Dump a sack into a pot with some bark, acorns, pine cones, and mouse meat, boil it all day, and the whole tribe ate like kings. Remove the husks first? Kobolds thought that was wasteful. Husks were delicious. Commercial grain. We kobolds have arrived. Watching them carry the rye home in triumph, carefully retrieving their empty or sacks too, I breathed easier. The kobold threat was handled for now, but I wasn't naive enough to think 20 pup hostages and a trade deal would guarantee lasting peace. In the short time I'd been watching, it was obvious that most kobolds couldn't even tell which pups were their own children. They simply didn't care. The only real guarantee of peace was strength. Back at camp, the militiamen guarding the pups looked miserable. What do we do with these things? They already chewed through the pig pen. With no adult kobolds around, we'd tossed the 20 pups into a freshly built enclosure, originally constructed by some young man trying to impress a pretty widow named Agata. She'd carried 2 baby pigs 1,000 miles south, sleeping with them in her blankets every night. Leo had tried to steal them several times and failed. The pigs still lived in her tent, which also kept the hopeful bachelors at bay. The pups had gnawed a hole in the fence within minutes and scattered through camp in a panic, chased by cursing militia. They looked like adorable, fluffy puppies, toddling upright a few steps, tumbling over, rolling on the ground. But their baby teeth were fully grown and sharp. Nobody dared let the human children near them. I walked into the pen. A cluster of pups was pressed against the fence, staring stupidly at the human kids on the other side. I dropped some sticks of firewood on the ground, pointed at the wood, bared my teeth, pointed at my teeth, then pointed hard at the fence, drew a finger across my throat. Understand? 20 pups squeezed into a terrified ball and nodded frantically. Smart little things. Olivia caught me threatening the kobold pups and laughed. How pathetic, a grown man bullying babies. Babies. Your babies live in pig pens, I shot back. These are your new kids. Raise them well. If one dies, the kobolds might revolt. I pointed at Olivia and told the pups, say mama, mama, mama. She rolled her eyes but crouched down to try communicating with them. Unfortunately, they'd only learned to be smart under my threats. With Olivia, all they could do was yell, mama, endlessly. Next morning, Uncle Urian rode off on a donkey with 2 militia and a sack of iron ore, heading for the nearest town, Isenball. It sat at the crossroads of the World Tree Road and the Anzino River, making it a small but busy trading hub. The World Tree Road was an ancient highway circling the Grand Barrier, a colossal ring of cliffs in the center of the continent that the elves called the World Tree. The road had existed for over 10,000 years, and nobody knew who built it. Our entire migration had followed this road southwest for 1,000 miles. Without it, Uncle Urian would never have attempted this journey. Everything west of the road technically belonged to the Frela family, one of the 7 great count families under the Northern Grand Duke. But in practice, humans only occupied the eastern fringe. The deep forests and mountains were still wild territory full of beasts and tribal settlements. Northern politics were simple compared to the rest of the empire. No barons or viscounts, just the Grand Duke, 7 counts with kingdom-sized territories, and their sworn knights. The empire had tried planting smaller nobles up here centuries ago to weaken the counts, but those weak lords got devoured within a generation. The north belonged to its ancient families. Isenball was about 100 miles from our camp, 30 miles of wilderness to the western watchtower, then 60 miles east along the World Tree Road. The town had the only bridge across the Upper Anzino and a river shipping route that ran all the way to the major northern city of Alanik. Most trade between the western and northern territories passed through here. With Uncle Urian gone, I confidently stepped up to run things. Nobody listened. The construction and farming crews had their own experienced leaders who treated my suggestions like noise. Camp management was entirely Olivia's domain, from food distribution to settling children's fights. She was the only literate person in a sea of illiterates, controlling the finances and able to do math. Among these dazed, exhausted villagers, this 16-year-old girl was basically a goddess of wisdom. Whatever she said was law. She walked around camp trailed by a flock of kobold pups waddling behind her like chicks following a mother hen. In 2 days, my only achievements besides militia training were using my muscles and threats to force the villagers to use the new latrines instead of relieving themselves around camp. Uncle Urian returned the second afternoon. First thing, he had men build a rough wooden dock by the river and ordered all or move to the riverbank. In 2 days, the enthusiastic kobolds had delivered nearly 10 tons of ore, trading it for 20 sacks of rye. The whole tribe had gone into a mining frenzy. If Uncle Urian had been any later, Olivia would have had to cut off the trade. We were running out of grain. "A boat's coming?" I asked, seeing the dock. It hit me then. The Anzino River ran all the way across the north. With boats, we could reach Isenball, or even the major city of Alanik downstream. Maybe even the sea. Of course, we'd need boats first. Uncle Urian gave me a smug look and said nothing, standing on the dock like some grand admiral. Half an hour of freezing river wind later, he was shivering and retreated to camp. "Watch the river. When you see boats, come get me." Little Mouse and I fished from the dock for over an hour. As the sky dimmed, for small boats finally appeared from downstream. Typical Anzino River fishing boats, barely 5 meters long, each able to carry maybe 500 pounds of fish. Not much, but we didn't even own a raft. The first boat was packed with people. The other 3 were loaded with cargo, each manned by just 2 fishermen with oars and poles. I sent Little Mouse to fetch Uncle Urian and waited on the dock. When the first boat bumped against the planks, I caught the rope and tied it off. "Welcome," I called out. The first person to step ashore was a young knight. Tall, golden-haired, blue-eyed, classic northerner. But his gear was something else entirely. He wore thin steel plates mounted on black hardened leather armor, polished to a mirror shine, with a soft leather lining peeking out at the edges. Black bearskin shoulder guards covered his neck and shoulders, and his wool cuffs had gold embroidery. A wide-bladed knight's sword hung on his back, big enough to swing two-handed, with a dagger strapped to his thigh. I stared at his equipment with naked envy. His armor was sleek and almost futuristic, nothing like the clunky medieval plate I'd imagined. Meanwhile, I looked like a bargain bin barbarian in my patchwork fur scraps. We both had bearskin shoulder guards, but his looked like designer fashion while mine looked like a caveman's cape. The knight glanced around at our shabby camp and frowned. He gave me a polite nod, completely ignored my rude staring, and walked straight past me toward Uncle Urian. "The river upstream is calm but full of rocks," he told Uncle Urian respectfully. "Bigger cargo ships won't risk it. I could only get these fishing boats. No problem, as long as you're here. We just set up, things are still rough. That's fine. I'm no noble either." The knight smiled. "I slept in plenty of tents when I served under you, Captain." Uncle Urian laughed and introduced him to everyone. "This is Roman Pedakov, a knight of the Pedakov family. My old comrade from the army." The Pedakovs were an established knight family in Isenball. Roman's father had been Uncle Urian's commanding officer at the Western Watchtower, and later Roman himself served under Uncle Urian at the Wind God Fortress. In the north, knight families didn't truly own their land. It was gifted by the count they served. They had to keep proving their worth through combat and military service, or risk losing everything. The Pedakovs had been doing this for over 100 years, sending sons into the army every generation, and now controlled 4 knight territories near Isenball, a prominent local family. "And this is my daughter, Olivia," Uncle Urian said. The knight's eyes had already found her. Surrounded by villagers who looked like beggars and savages, Olivia stood out like a flower blooming in a wasteland. "Good day, my lady." Roman placed his hand on his chest and bowed gracefully. Olivia startled like a rabbit and bobbed her head twice, then awkwardly stuck out her right hand, mixing up her etiquette. Roman smiled without correcting her. Smooth, composed, every inch the nobleman. Olivia yanked her hand back and hid behind me. "And this is my nephew, Leo Mondo." "Hello, Knight Roman," I said eagerly. He glanced at me and nodded once. Rude staring, no manners, uneducated peasant boy, dismissed. After a tour of camp, we sat in Uncle Urian's tent. Roman frowned. "Captain, this is your pioneer territory?" "It is. What do you think?" "It's not quite what your letter described. You mentioned nearly 1,000 settlers and a well-trained militia capable of handling the local threats." He chose his words carefully. "There seems to be a slight discrepancy. Well, people are attached to their homeland. Many chose to stay up north. Can't force them." Uncle Urian waved it off. "But don't worry. Once we're established, second and third waves of settlers will come. We'll hit 1,000 in no time. In a few years, this will be the biggest pioneer territory near Isenball. Your father's investment will return tenfold, 100-fold, pure bluff. Who'd voluntarily come to this dangerous wilderness?" Even beggars in Isenball would turn that offer down. My father won't be swayed by promises alone, Roman said diplomatically. But I believe in you, Captain. Besides the food and farm tools we agreed on, I've brought 20 steel swords from my personal savings. 2 years' worth. Good lad. I knew I didn't look after you for nothing. Uncle Urian beamed, then leaned in. Put in a good word with your father, will you? Tell him we're thriving here, strong and secure, just a tiny bit short on funds. A son sweet-talking his old man. How hard can it be? Roman looked uncomfortable. I'll say what I can, but my father's not easily fooled. He'll send someone to investigate. He already sent someone. Old Riggerlav only has one precious son. If he doesn't trust you, who will he trust? Uncle Urian threw an arm around Roman's shoulders, his weathered face oozing charm. Then he gestured at Olivia. So what do you think of my daughter? You two should get to know each other. His gaze landed on me standing next to Olivia, looking unimpressed. What are you standing around for, you brat? Go unload the boats. Kicked out of the tent, I sat on a log by the dock, stewing. In my inherited memories, Uncle Urian had always been the unshakable leader, the savior, the strongman, the tyrant. Watching him grovel and flatter a young knight felt deeply wrong. But the modern part of me understood perfectly. This was pitching to investors. Nothing shameful about it. Keep the nobleman happy, and supplies come rolling in. Everyone benefits. Still felt bad, though. I must be the most pathetic transmigrator in history, I muttered to myself. Other guys wake up as noble heirs or knight lords. I'm still a wage slave, except now I don't even get wages. Other transmigrators get systems, stat screens, or mysterious old mentors. What did I get? A one-track mind and a bloodline that lowers my IQ. The river route to Isenball was shallow, rocky, and full of forks, usable only by tiny fishing boats piloted by local fishermen who'd spent their lives navigating it. Large-scale river trade wasn't happening anytime soon. The real lifeline would be a land road through those 30 miles of forest to the western watchtower, connecting us to the World Tree Road. But first, we had to survive. And Knight Roman's supplies were our medicine. Olivia escaped the tent and found me by the water. She sat down and studied my face, looking uncertain. She could feel the change in me. The old Leo had been simple, reckless, hot-blooded, every thought written on his face. They'd grown up fighting and teasing each other, but were as close as siblings. After her mother died and her father was still away in the army, those 2 years had been terrifying for her. Village men would climb her walls at night, but they always found Leo's fist waiting for them. Now I was different, quieter. I'd catch myself staring into nothing, lost in thought, something the old Leo would never have done. He'd spent his free time rolling in the dirt, ambushing village kids, or poking ant hills all afternoon. What? Not going to attend to your dear knight? I snapped, the old Leo flaring up on instinct. Olivia grinned. You're jealous. Jealous of what? I fired back. I hear the hand kiss is reserved for married women or fiancés. Looks like Uncle Urian's selling you off. It's not like that. I just made a fool of myself. She'd learned about the hand kiss from gossip sessions at the river with village girls and stuck her hand out in a panic. She played at being upset. First time meeting a knight, and I botched the etiquette. How embarrassing. Though he is rather handsome and elegant. Maybe marrying him wouldn't be so bad. I lunged for her hand. Then I'm kissing it too. Get away from me, she laughed, bracing herself on the rocks, kicking at me to keep me back. After the silliness died down, she fixed. Her hair, studied me again, confirmed I was still the old him, and with a shy little breath of courage, held out the back of her hand to me. I looked at it. My eyes narrowed. Before she could react, I slapped the back of her hand as hard as I could and bolted, cackling. You animal. Get back here, she screamed in formal imperial, hiking up her skirt to chase me. Meanwhile, inside the tent, Uncle Urian and Roman were having a much more serious conversation. Roman's father, the family patriarch Riggerlav, was cautious about investing in Uncle Urian's venture. A commoner leading settlers into the wilderness? Hard to believe in. If it failed quickly, at least the losses would be small. What scared him was a slow failure that dragged the Petikov family down with it. Then Roman brought up something that made it all very clear. Captain, do you know how we got our third night territory? The one south of the western watchtower? He told Uncle Urian the story. A knight family called Misevich had spent 20 years, 2 generations, pioneering a village of 100 households from nothing. When the old knight died, the territory was simply handed to Roman's uncle instead of the son, because the son hadn't awakened, hadn't reached some level of personal power. And no one in the political landscape would defend a weak, broke knight family with no backing. Roman's message was blunt, even if his words were polite. You're a commoner. No family behind you. You haven't awakened either. You have no money, no military power, and only a daughter. No impressive heir worth another family's investment. Even if you succeed at pioneering, someone stronger will just take it from you. That was the brutal reality. Without strength and connections, building something meant nothing if you couldn't protect it. Inside the tent, Uncle Urien had apparently dropped his mask and told Roman the truth. He didn't care about becoming a noble. He'd never wanted to be a pioneer knight. What he cared about was survival. The North Ice River was falling apart. Orc clans were pouring south, raiding like locusts. The Empire was cutting military budgets, disbanding standing armies. The Wind God Fortress garrison had been slashed from 5,000 to under 1,000, not even enough to fill the wall positions. The Northern Grand Duke was pulling troops from every count's territory, but the Southern lords didn't care. They were waiting for the orcs to invade so they could attack from behind and carve up the north. Uncle Urien couldn't save the north. He could only take his people and walk south as far as possible. This river bend was as far as he could go. His real goal had always been simple: settle his daughter and his people somewhere safe before he died. If the territory got handed to someone else later, so what? Better than being slaughtered by orcs. Roman understood. Uncle Urien could have taken his savings and his daughter to some comfortable southern town and lived out his days in peace. But he couldn't abandon hundreds of people who were practically family, cousins, in-laws, neighbors from villages where everyone was related somehow. As a village headman, an imperial sergeant, effectively a clan chief, how could he just run? That was the northern way. Blood ties above everything. You're thinking about whether this investment pays off, Uncle Urien told Roman. I'm thinking about how to keep my people alive. I don't have a choice. Roman left the next day, his fishing boats loaded with iron ore, promising to convince his father. He'd toured the camp, listened to Uncle Urien brag about making the kobolds surrender, offered some local advice, and headed downstream. The iron trade would work like this, or sorted into 3 quality grades, exchanged for 1 to 2 times its weight in grain. Fisha tried to send only the best ore, but the dumber kobolds would drag over worthless rocks just because they were big and heavy, hoping for more food. Those reject stones weren't useless though, perfect for building dams and house foundations. The good ore went to blacksmiths in Isenball, who'd forge it into tools, hardware, and weapons, then ship some back. The deal was fair. The North wasn't actually short on iron deposits, just short on miners and transportation. The tiny fishing boats making 100-mile round trips added huge costs. Until we built a proper road through those 30 miles of forest, this trade could only stay small scale. Without Uncle Urien's personal connection to the Petakovs, nobody would bother with such a risky, low-volume deal. Roman had brought nearly a ton of wheat and a boatload of iron farming tools, rivets, and saw blades. Seeing the grain carts refilled, the villagers were ecstatic. Morale shot through the roof. And this wasn't the sour, gritty rye we'd been choking down. This was quality wheat from the Anzino River region. The Petakov steward had politely mentioned that in Isenball, rye was barely grown. What little they had was usually cut before it even ripened and fed to donkeys. A ton of wheat sounded like a lot, but split among 300 people, even stretched with other ingredients, it would last maybe a week. The real treasure was the iron tools and Roman's personal gift, 20 military-grade steel swords. These were proper northern-style, single-handed blades, thick and heavy, nothing like the bendy iron bars village blacksmiths hammered out. On the Isenball market, one of these swords was worth a ton of wheat. As Uncle Urien's #1 fighter, I got the first sword. My opinion of Knight Roman improved dramatically. I sat on a barrel by the kitchen, flicking the blade with my finger, feeling the solid vibration die away instantly. Sharp edge, deep blood grooves for balance, a thick flexible spine that wouldn't snap or bend. My old iron sword used to bend every time I stabbed someone too hard. I'd have to stomp it straight again. I couldn't even swing it at bone without it chipping apart like a candle melting. With this sword and armor like Roman's, I wouldn't just beat a kobold chief. I'd challenge Uncle Urian himself. If Roman gives me his armor too, I told Olivia, I'll support your dad selling. I mean, marrying you off to him. You're disgusting, she said, not looking up from her inventory. A few kobold pups hiding under her skirt sensed her annoyance and poked their little heads out to bark at me. I glared. They vanished back under the fabric instantly. With Roman's iron tools, work sped up fast. Before this, we didn't even have enough hose for everyone. Half the workers had been breaking ground with bare hands or using tiny kobold pickaxes. When it came time to cut trees for building, the lack of tools had been crippling. No saws, no proper axes. The trees in the western forest were massive, most too thick for two people to wrap their arms around. I joined the logging crew one morning with my new tools and high spirits. After spending the entire morning helping to fell, cut, and haul back a single tree, my enthusiasm was completely dead. This pace was unbearable, so I decided to scout upriver instead. Not because I was lazy. There was a wild folk tribe near the source waterfall, and I needed to know what we were dealing with. I wasn't about to rush in with my farmer militia, though. Northern settlements away from the farmland were mostly hunting and herding communities. Javelins and bows were standard equipment. Wild folk living deep in the forest would be even better armed. If I marched a squad of peasant soldiers into their territory, we'd probably get turned into pincushions before we even spotted them. From what Fisha had told me, this particular group didn't seem especially hostile. They traded with the kobolds, baskets, and linen for iron. Maybe we could work something out peacefully too. I told our patrol scouts to stay within 10 miles upstream and avoid confrontation at all costs. Those scouts were Uncle Urian's hand-trained best, and losing even one would be a disaster. But the better they were, the more likely they'd bump into wild folk, and any casualties on either side would make enemies of us forever. First contact had to go right. As the camp's second-best talker, Uncle Urian being first, I'd go myself. I followed the Enzino upstream. The terrain grew steep and rocky, the river splitting into narrow rapids between jagged boulders, with small waterfalls every few hundred meters. After 10 miles or so, I heard something and ducked into the tree shadows. On a gravel bank below, a handful of young kobolds stood in the shallows, stabbing at the water with wooden spears. One thrust hard and pulled up nothing. It barked in frustration. Then the one next to it squealed with joy, a foot-long black fish wriggling on its spear tip. The lucky kobold bit straight into the fish's belly, tearing off a chunk. Instantly the others tackled it, and within 10 seconds the fish was gone. Just a few wisps of blood dissolving in the current. These were barely adult kobolds who'd gotten bored hauling and snuck off to fish. Reckless teenagers, basically. I crouched down and picked up a stone, grinning, ready to teach them a lesson about wilderness awareness. Then I froze. A chill shot through my body. Every instinct screamed danger. I looked up. On a boulder above the river stood a tall figure, staring down at me. He wore stitched animal hides. A complete wolf skull served as his helmet, shadowing most of his face. When he tilted his head forward, he looked like a wolf standing on two legs. Beast teeth and bone shards were sewn into the fur at his wrists, shoulders, and waist. Not just decoration, but functional armor and weapons. 2 hand axes hung at his belt. A massive longbow and a quiver rode his back. A white bone spear was planted in the ground beside him. He looked like a barbarian from a video game, except real, and far more terrifying than any costume could convey. The difference between us was like the difference between a deer and a wolf. We dressed similarly, but his presence radiated killing intent. We stared at each other across the river, the oblivious kobolds still splashing between us. After a few seconds, seeing he wasn't reaching for a weapon, I let the stone drop from my hand and slowly raised both palms. I stood up and gave him my best friendly smile. The stone clattered down the rocks and splashed into the water. The kobolds looked up, spotted the wild folk hunter, and scrambled backward, hiding their wooden spears behind their backs. They didn't even dare point them in his direction. One tiny kobold, barely 3 feet tall, bravely bared its teeth at the hunter and immediately got bonked on the head by a companion. It deflated. The hunter waved a hand. The kobolds fled into the forest like startled birds. Interesting. They feared him, but not like they feared death. More like school kids caught doing something naughty by a strict elder, worried about a scolding, not their lives. Once the kobolds were gone, the hunter studied me one last time, then stepped back and vanished behind the boulder. Too bad, didn't even get to say hello and ask if he'd eaten. I watched the wildfolk hunter vanish and didn't follow. He'd made his message perfectly clear without a single word. Just one cold look that said, "This is as far as you go. Next time I won't be so polite." I had no intention of pushing it. Growing up half-wild had given this body sharp instincts, and every nerve told me that man was dangerous. The wild folk survived in forests crawling with hostile tribes, giant predators, and magical beasts. Every member of their tribe was a skilled hunter. A lone patroller like him was the elite of the elite. That longbow on his back, a 6-foot yew bow with finger-thick heavy arrows, could kill a brown bear. My oakenhide shield, thick as it was, wouldn't stop a close-range shot from that thing. Over the next few days, I patrolled upstream while training the militia, mapping the terrain, and watching for threats. I never crossed past the boulder where the hunter had appeared. No sense catching a mystery arrow. As my scouting range expanded, I started venturing into the dense forest across the river. The wildlife here was far more abundant, and strange tracks I'd never seen started appearing. Is this a wild boar? Since when do boars have flat feet? And someone's chasing it. I sketched every unknown print to show Uncle Urian later. He'd know. Then I found a track that stopped me cold. A massive claw print, shaped like a human hand, but with razor-sharp talons. A foot long, total. Whatever left this was far beyond anything I could handle alone. Time to head back and get help. I turned around and felt the ground trembling. Trees swaying in the distance. Something big was coming. I scrambled up a pine tree, climbing 30 feet before looking down. A colossal yellowish-brown beast crashed through the forest below me, over 10 feet long, barreling past in a panic. Its hip barely grazed my tree as it passed, and the whole trunk shook so violently I nearly fell. Behind it charged 4 wild boars with single rhinoceros-like horns on their heads, grunting and snorting in pursuit. Turn around and fight them, you idiot. All 4 of them together don't weigh as much as you. The boars were huge, each one the size of a small rhino. But next to this van-sized beast, they looked like piglets chasing their mother. I couldn't understand what it was so afraid of. I waited a minute, and then 4 burly humanoid figures jogged past below, following the giant beast's trail. They were about 5'8", massively built with slightly hunched postures. Coarse black hair covered their exposed skin, and stiff bristles ran along their heads and spines like porcupine quills. They carried bone spears and stone hammers, with crude crossbows strapped to their backs. One paused beneath my tree and sniffed the air, looking around. I got a clear view of its face. Boarmen, 200 pounds each, dark-skinned, hairy, with thick stubby limbs and actual pig heads, complete with curved tusks jutting from their jaws. These were far more dangerous than kobolds. Those stone hammers, bone spears, and crossbows could seriously hurt me. I held my breath and watched them pass. After a few more minutes of silence, I started climbing down. 1 foot touched the ground, and the trembling came back. The giant beast had circled around and was running straight back toward me with the boar hunters in pursuit. Are you kidding me? Fight somewhere else. I launched myself back up the tree. I sat in the branches watching the absurd chase loop past below, then decided to move. I sprinted along a thick branch and leaped to the next tree, then the next, swinging through the canopy like Tarzan until the forest thinned out and I could see ahead. The giant beast had been cornered against a small dirt hill. The slope was only about 25 feet, but the soft ground couldn't support its enormous weight. It tried climbing 3 times and slid back down each time, its paws digging like excavator scoops while its body went nowhere, practically burying itself in mud. With the boarmen and their horned pigs closing in, it reared up on its hind legs, pressed its back against the hill, and swatted its front paws in the air a few times. Then it opened its mouth and screamed. "Don't come any closer," that high-pitched, squeaky voice. Those massive front teeth, standing upright with its little paws raised. This wasn't a bear at all. It was a marmot. A giant, van-sized, screaming marmot. And it could talk. After all this time in a fantasy world, Things were finally starting to feel properly magical. So this is a magical beast? But why is it losing to boarmen? It doesn't seem very tough. I watched from the trees as the giant marmot was cornered against the hillside. For horned boars pawed the ground but didn't dare charge. The boarmen stood back, firing crossbows. The marmot covered its eyes with its paws and just took it. No fighting back whatsoever. The bolts hit its forehead and bounced off like chalk sticks. Didn't even ruffle its fur. My mouth started watering. I quietly drew a javelin. A marmot, herbivore, gentle temperament, easy to tame. The boarmen were actually more frustrated than the marmot. Their crossbows could kill wolves and snow leopards, could seriously wound a brown bear, but couldn't scratch this thing. Up close, they were completely outmatched. Their 600-pound horned boars couldn't even budge it. One swipe of its paw could send a 200-pound boarman flying 15 feet. But it was too cowardly to actually fight. Apparently, I'd piece this together later. This marmot had eaten the boarmen's entire winter supply of deerhorn cassava, then tunneled 2 miles through solid rock just to raid their food cave. They'd chase it, it would run and cry, and a few days later it would forget and come back to steal again. One boarman put down its weapon and pulled out a flint and torch, planning to try fire. That's when I threw my javelin. It flew from the tree line and punched clean through the boarman's thick neck, the tip poking out the other side. It grabbed the wound, tried to pull out the spear, swayed once, and collapsed dead. The other 3 panicked, ducking behind trees. One sent a horned boar sniffing toward where I'd thrown from. The beast circled around and looped back toward its own master. Too late. I launched another javelin from above, pinning the boarman's foot to the ground. It shrieked like a stuck pig and fired a wild crossbow shot before ripping the spear out and crawling away. The marmot saw the chaos and suddenly found its courage. It started waving its curved claws in the air, making fierce baby voice screams, adorably threatening, which spooked the remaining horned boars into backing off. Caught between me and the marmot, the surviving boarmen grabbed their dead and wounded and fled into the forest. I climbed down. Hello there. The marmot stood upright, showed me its enormous front teeth in what might have been a smile, then suddenly screamed. Run, it bolted. Before I could react, the forest behind me erupted with grunting. Over a dozen horned boars burst from the trees, followed by even more boarman crossbowmen. Reinforcements. I looked back. The marmot was already gone. I ran for my life. By the time I reached the Anzino River, the boarmen were far behind. My shield had 2 crossbow bolts embedded in it from the initial volley. They'd fired a storm of arrows through the trees. The whistling and thudding sounds had been terrifying. In open ground, my little round shield wouldn't have saved me. Luckily, I'd grown up being chased through forests by bears and boars. Running away was my greatest talent. Once the horned boars left their master's command range, they slowed down and got confused, and I pulled away. Sitting on a riverside rock, catching my breath, I spotted the giant marmot upstream, face buried in the river, drinking. Hey there, I called from a distance so I wouldn't scare it. I'm Leo. I'm a human. The marmot stood up on its hind legs, over 10 feet tall, covered in dense fur over layers of wobbling fat. It studied me curiously and spoke in the cutest baby voice imaginable. I'm Freya. I'm an elven druid. I walked closer, craning my neck. This thing was the size of a small car. Had to weigh close to 2 tons. An elf? I said, disappointed it wasn't a tameable magical beast. Elves all look like this. A flash of annoyance crossed its eyes. It turned 90 degrees and sat down with its back to me, sulking. I am an elven druid. This is my giant bear form. You sure about bear? I am. Hey, giant. Bear. Freya growled each word through clenched teeth. Okay, giant bear form. Where's your home? Want me to walk you back? She looked up at the distant waterfall, her expression turning sad. I can't go back. She didn't want to talk about it. Some tragic backstory, obviously. Every NPC had one. I stood on my tiptoes and stroked her soft back fur. Then come to my place. I'll feed you something delicious. Elf, bear, talking marmot, didn't matter. Get her home first, figure out the rest later. Freya whipped her head around with lightning speed, eyes blazing. What kind of delicious? Walking back into camp with a bus-sized beast behind me caused quite a stir. Everyone assumed it was a magical beast. Even the biggest snow bears up north didn't grow this large. In this world, magical beasts were rare for the same reasons tigers are rare on Earth. They're apex predators needing huge territories, and humans hunt them relentlessly. Adventure parties would swarm any reported sighting until the creature was dead. Every part of a magical beast was valuable. By now, even legendary dragons only survived in volcanoes, frozen peaks, or wastelands thousands of miles from civilization. Ordinary people only ever saw a magical beast right before being eaten. But this terrifying beast was more scared than anyone. Freya kept her enormous body crammed behind me, trying to hide her head under my arm. The militia stood at a distance with weapons drawn. Only Little Mouse had the guts to run up, grabbing my leg and staring at the giant marmot with wide eyes. The two mice, one huge, one tiny, peeked at each other from either side of me with matching expressions of nervous curiosity. Once Freya saw nobody was attacking, she stood upright and waddled into camp on two legs. She spotted the cooking pots by the central fire and immediately sat down like an obedient puppy waiting for dinner, eyes shining. Olivia looked at me with alarm. I waved her off. Extra meal. I'm treating my new friend to dinner. She relaxed slightly. At least the beast wasn't here to eat people. She eyed Freya's size. How much extra? A whole pot. Fine. I sat with Freya by the fire and tried to learn her story. I had to crane my neck to see her face, so I moved further back. Can't you turn back into an elf? You're scaring the children. I can't, she said in that adorable baby voice, looking miserable. My teacher hasn't taught me the reverse spell yet. Where's your teacher? Where's your home? She pointed a paw at the distant waterfall. My home is on top of the cliff. I fell off. I can't get back. Fell off? From that height. King Kong would have been flattened. I can fly, she huffed, puffing herself up. She twisted around to show me her back. Look, wings. Two tiny feathered nubs poked out of her fur. They looked exactly like a rubber duck's wings. I walked over and poked one. These can fly. Freya stood, flapped furiously, and jumped. She crashed back down, shaking the earth. Then she turned to me with a proud, expectant grin. Did I fly? I asked uncertainly. That was landing, she corrected angrily. The wings slow my fall. That's why I survived, okay. You can fly. I covered my face. But you're not getting back up there anytime soon. She wasn't worried at all. My teacher will come find me when he wakes up. How long does he sleep? He says mastering advanced shape-shifting requires fully experiencing the animal form's habits. So he hibernates every winter. When spring comes, he'll wake up. Before I could ask more, her attention locked onto the food. The camp normally ran 3 big pots, 1 old clay one and 2 iron ones Uncle Urian had commissioned. Each held over 100 liters, enough for about 100 people. Since the kobold iron trade started bringing in grain, we've been filling all 3 every meal, the stew getting thicker by the day. Olivia had even started baking wheat flatbread for the heavy laborers, unthinkable luxury just a week ago. Now a 4th emergency pot was fired up and loaded with ingredients. As the village women stirred it with pine sticks, the smell spread across camp. Freya and the camp children formed a united front, inhaling deeply together, trying not to let any aroma escape. Meanwhile, I gutted some fresh fish and showed off my grilling and steaming skills. When dinner was finally ready, Olivia carried over a big clay bowl of stew, the size of a human head, and set it before Freya with a kind smile. Freya sat primly, delicately picked up the bowl, which looked like a teacup against her massive skull. She tilted her head back, drained it in one gulp. Then her tongue swept the bowl cleaner than it had been before the stew went in. She placed it down gently, nudged it toward Olivia with one claw, and sat there looking angelic. Delicious. Little Mouse stared into the empty bowl and looked deeply envious. Olivia's jaw dropped. Maybe. Just use the pot directly? Don't mind if I do. Freya's head bobbed happily. She would have called Olivia Mama if the kobold pups hadn't claimed it first. 1 full pot of boiling stew disappeared. Then, despite my punching and kicking, Freya performed a series of eating stunts for the delighted children. How to eat a steamed fish and a grilled fish the exact same way. Hold it up, slide it into mouth, pull out a perfect skeleton, followed by swallowing a 3-foot breadstick whole, and chewing raw barley and deerhorn cassava like popcorn. The kids went, wow, at the fish skeleton trick. But they weren't impressed by her eating skills. They were jealous she had fish at all. I watched my carefully prepared dishes vanish into the bottomless marmot, feeling my status among the camp children slipping away. After dinner, everyone sprawled around the campfire while the village women cleaned up. The rest of the camp was busy, militia training with javelins and slings, young men begging to spar and getting beaten up, villagers reinforcing their tents with rocks, branches, and bark, turning them into half-buried shelters that could stop a stray arrow or spear. On the highest ground, a ring of stone foundations was slowly taking shape. The Lord's Hall, not vanity. In the north, the Lord's Hall was the heart of any village. It served as courthouse, warehouse, and emergency shelter. When enemies came, women and children hid behind its thick doors while the men fought. Without it, we weren't a settlement, just a campsite. I sat by the fire, idly straightening a strand of little mouse's black hair until it stood up like an antenna. "This is your receiving antenna," I told her. "Like a third eye or a third ear. It makes you smarter." She stared cross-eyed at the hair flopping down and quickly smoothed it back up. "I want one too." Freya tried to pinch her forehead fur upright with her stubby paws. Too short. Couldn't reach. Couldn't stand up. That night I put Freya in the kobold pen, which had been expanded into something like a stable, taller walls, a branch roof, thick bedding of leaves and hay. Even some furs Olivia had donated so her adopted children wouldn't freeze. Freya peered over the fence at the pups huddled inside and gave me a disgusted look. "EW. You humans eat kobolds. Try one. Pop a whole kid in your mouth." "Delicious." I shoved her through the gate. The pups understood enough to panic. They squealed and piled on top of each other. Freya squeezed in, flopped on her back, and took up most of the building. Not bad. After we left, Olivia grabbed my sleeve. "Stop bringing things home." She ticked off the list in her head. First I brought home a little girl and put her in my tent. The village women all gossiped I was raising a future wife. Olivia had swallowed her anger because at least I'd saved a life. And once little Mouse was cleaned up and fed for a while, she'd become a cute kid instead of a mud-caked skeleton with sunken eyes and poison-green skin from eating too many toxic bugs and roots. Then the kobold pups, they ate everything, pooped everywhere. But they were obedient and cute, following Olivia around yelling, "Mama," which she secretly enjoyed. Now a 2-ton marmot that ate an entire pot of stew per meal. I picked my nose and shrugged. "Which one do you want me to get rid of?" Olivia froze, tortured by the choice, and said nothing. Next morning, she dragged me out of the tent by my ear. Look at what your thing did." Outside camp, Freya sat alone at the edge of the fields, ears drooping, paws folded over her belly, covered in dirt. She looked like a 4,000-pound husky that knew it had been bad. The freshly plowed farmland was destroyed. Giant holes and tunnels everywhere. The soil that our plows had carefully loosened was now compressed harder than before under her massive weight. The villagers were already out there filling craters and retilling crushed earth. They were too afraid of the giant beast to complain, which only made Freya feel worse. Fun fact I should have remembered: marmots are pests. "What did you do?" I yelled up at her. "I just wanted to help," she whimpered. She'd woken before dawn, felt guilty about eating so much, and tried to copy the farmers by digging soil. But every patch her front paws loosened, her back legs crushed flat. She'd spun in circles, making it worse and worse. By sunrise, she'd ruined at least 2 acres. When the villagers found her, she'd already forgotten her original purpose and was happily playing in a mud pit she'd dug. I mentally stamped "problem child" on her forehead, but I couldn't exactly punish a creature that could flatten me if it sneezed wrong. So I smiled and beckoned. "Come with me. Is it time to eat?" Freya sprang to her feet, eyes blazing with hope. I led the big marmot to the northwest side of the peninsula where the irrigation ditch was being dug. On the other side of the dirt slope, just 20 feet away, was the upper Anzino River. Once the canal was finished and this last stretch was broken through, river water would flow across the entire peninsula, watering over 1,000 acres. So far, 50 workers had spent a full week digging and only managed 500 meters. The ditch was roughly 6 feet wide at the top, 3 feet at the bottom, and about 6 feet deep, a simple trapezoid shape. Uncle Urian's original plan called for a canal cutting clean across the peninsula, turning the whole thing into an island. Add walls along the banks someday, and we'd have a fortress farm safe from forest creatures. But that plan assumed 1,000 workers. For now, we just needed 2 kilometers connecting a few small lakes to drain the swampy farmland up north. See this ditch? I pointed from where it ended toward the distant hillside. Can you dig from here all the way to those rocks? Digging? I'm the best at digging. Freya took a few test swipes, glanced up to make sure I wasn't angry, and when I cheered her on, she went full throttle. She belly flopped into the dirt, and her front claws became a blur. Hard clay, soft sand. Everything crumbled like styrofoam under those razor-sharp claws. Dirt sprayed out behind her in a fountain, while the ditch extended forward at visible speed. This wasn't a pest. This was an excavator. A medieval excavator. She was more like a harvesting machine. Actually, all 4 paws spinning, solid earth and sedimentary rock vanishing in front of her and exploding out behind. She was digging with her tongue flapping and her eyes wild, like a husky set free in a yard. By the time the work crew arrived, Freya had already pushed forward dozens of meters. 50 men stood there getting pelted by flying dirt clods, watching a trench materialize faster than their entire team could manage in a day. What are you standing around for? Move. Uncle Urian snapped them into action, hauling dirt, shoring up the walls, working before groundwater seeped in and ruined the trench. Last night, he'd been wondering how to get rid of this food-devouring druid. Now he just wanted to give her seconds. He sidled up to me, grinning. Where'd you find this giant rat? She's a hard worker. She's a giant bear. Giant bear form druid. I corrected him firmly. Yes, giant bear. He'd call her a chinchilla if it kept her digging. I described my encounter with the boarmen in detail, their size, weapons, crossbows, tusked faces. Uncle Urian dropped his carefree act. As a veteran wilderness scout, he could estimate a tribe's strength from description alone. That's trouble. These aren't kobolds. How much trouble? More than we can handle alone. We both stared at the distant waterfall and said nothing more. Freya's excavator mode made the canal fly forward, so fast the 50-person cleanup crew could barely keep up. She had quirks, of course, stopping to nibble every tree root, admiring pretty rocks, and once I found her asleep, buried in her own dirt pile, snoring. The only way to keep her moving was promising food. By noon I'd pledged the entire camp's food supply to her. She dug all the way to the base of a small rocky ridge that jutted into the peninsula, blocking the canal's path. Uncle Urian's plan called for turning the ditch east along the ridge, adding a long detour around it to reach a lake on the other side. We had no way to cut through solid rock, or so I thought. Freya reached the stone wall and didn't slow down. She pressed one paw against the rock, lazily traced a circle, and pushed. The stone crumbled like a rice cracker. Chunks fell away, and within seconds there was a hole the size of a wash basin. She kept widening and deepening it, and in under 5 minutes her entire head had disappeared into the rock face. An unstoppable tunnel-boring machine. I was officially jealous. I ran back to camp to get Olivia to make Freya some proper food. Wheat flatbread, not just porridge. A worker this good deserved something solid. What? Put cheese in the flatbread? Olivia was furious. We don't have cheese. Then what's this? I ducked into the supply cart and pulled out a small barrel. Pine nuts? Sprinkle some. Almonds? Sprinkle some. I rummaged through her secret stash with one hand while fending off her attacks with the other. Anything that smelled good went on the list. I had to get back to the work site fast. If I left Freya alone, she'd quit immediately. Sure enough, when I got there, she'd stopped digging. She was standing on the canal bank, staring across at a group of kobolds who'd frozen in their tracks, terrified by the giant beast. Fisha was among them, her black and white fur unmistakable. They'd come to deliver iron ore, their daily routine by now. After the initial frenzy, deliveries had slowed since the easy surface or was gone, and most kobolds preferred mining their beloved shinies or hunting. But Fisha still came twice a day, faithfully trading for grain. Her tribe's food distribution followed traditional rules. Adults ate first, and the elderly, mothers, and pups got less than a third of what the warriors received. The grown kobolds were full. The weak ones were still starving. The kobolds wouldn't cross the ditch with Freya nearby, and Freya wouldn't go back in the ditch with kobolds around. She was terrified they'd bite her rear end. Come on, Let's eat, I called to Freya. Mealtime. Her tiny ears shot straight up and she thundered toward camp. Problem instantly forgotten. Once she was gone, the kobolds dared to cross. I invited Fisha to eat with us. She'd gotten comfortable with the camp by now, visiting daily, checking on her pups, even staying for meals at Olivia's invitation. Her Imperial was improving fast. Back at camp, Freya was already chomping on her special flatbreads, lid-sized, thick, topped with pine nuts, dried dates, and almonds, fresh from the fire. She had 3 of them. Every child in camp was crying from jealousy, drool streaming down their chins. Olivia handed out scraps of leftover flatbread to the kids. Even plain wheat bread with bran was infinitely better than sour rye. While eating, I asked Fisha what she knew about the boarmen across the river. Her tail stopped wagging. Boarmen. Very strong. Very scary. Across river. Super many. Kobolds. Never cross river. Over the past week, Fisha's common tongue had improved dramatically. She explained that across the Anzino, in the pine forests of the old Wolf Drive Plains, there were several Boorman tribes. The nearest one occupied a rocky hill area about 30 miles away, roughly 200 strong. A third were warriors, most of the rest were hunters, with very few elderly or weak. The kobolds rarely clashed with them because of the distance. The only trouble came during pine nut season, when kobolds would sneak across the river to forage and lose 7 or 8 of their number to boarman hunting parties. For kobolds, that was nothing. The wild folk near the waterfall, however, fought the boarmen constantly. The path to the wild folk settlement was lined with boarman skulls. I already knew some of this from Uncle Urian's earlier briefings. Boarman society was strictly hierarchical, built entirely around food distribution. Warriors got full rations, grew massive and muscular, physically on par with the Empire's Tier 3 heavy elite infantry. They wore the best fur armor, carried heavy weapons and crossbows, and rode trained horned boars. 10 Boarman warriors could dominate the wilderness. Below warriors were hunters, weaker males, females, and crippled former warriors. They got half rations, carried hand-me-down gear, and handled foraging, guard duty, and served as cover fire or cannon fodder in battle. They were noticeably smaller than warriors, but still bigger than most humans. At the bottom were the elderly and weak, surviving on a quarter of warrior rations, barely enough to stay alive. Nearly every wild tribe used some version of this system. It looked unfair, but in the wilderness it maximized fighting strength. Boarmen were brutal, aggressive, and hostile to everything, including their own kind. They were omnivores who'd eat literally anything. Wherever a Boarman tribe settled, nothing within 30 miles was safe, plant or animal. So the wild folk and Boarmen fight regularly? I zeroed in on the most interesting part of Fish's briefing. Boarmen, very strong. Wild folk, super strong. Longbow, unbeatable. Fish's eyes glowed with admiration, her flatbread forgotten as she waved her paws around. I thought to myself, when you offered to surrender and leave, you were probably planning to run to the wild folk and beg them to get revenge for you. But outwardly I smiled. Could you introduce me to the wild folk, chief? Maybe we can work together against the Boarmen. How do you make friends fast? Find a common enemy. 30 miles of wilderness between us and the Boarmen wasn't that far. Sooner or later, they'd come knocking. And unlike kobolds, Boarmen couldn't be talked down. They didn't even understand common language. While you were figuring out how to communicate, they were figuring out how to cook you. Fisha looked uncomfortable. Her relationship with the wild folk wasn't as close as I'd assumed. The wild folk treated her kobold tribe the way rural folks treated the stray dogs outside the village. No real hostility, but no real bond either. They traded iron or once every month or two, and occasionally helped out if they were in a good mood. The wild folk simply didn't take kobolds seriously, just let them exist as a natural early warning system. Come to think of it, when I'd attacked the Kobold Valley, the wild folk must have known. They probably watched from the shadows, waiting to see how things played out. Olivia came by and spotted Little Mouse with breadcrumbs all over her face. She slapped the towel on and scrubbed her clean without a word. Freya immediately saw an opportunity. She dropped flat, stretched her neck out, and shoved her enormous head into Olivia's arms, eyes closed, waiting to be pampered. 2 meals was all it had taken for Olivia to completely tame this marmot. If Olivia and I both fell in the river, Freya would absolutely rescue Olivia first. Olivia was still nervous around the giant beast, but Freya looked so harmless and eager that she gave in and carefully wiped the crumbs off the marmot's face. Then she turned and locked eyes with Fisha, whose dog face was equally covered in food. Olivia hesitated for exactly 1 second, then slapped the towel on Fisha's head and wiped her down too. Fisha froze, completely bewildered by this unexpected burst of motherly care. I stared at Olivia's seamless routine. Child, marmot, kobold, and nearly suspected my grandmother had transmigrated into her body. After eating, Freya leaned back contentedly, rubbing her belly. You want to visit the village under the big waterfall? I can take you. You've been there. Then it clicked. Did they kick you out for eating too much? I did eat too much, but I wasn't kicked out. She kicked her stubby legs angrily. I left on my own. Why? Because they were too nice to me. Too nice, so you ran away? What kind of logic is that? Should I beat you twice a week so you'll stay? Just come and you'll understand. She turned her massive rear end toward me and refused to say another word. Our little campfire group had become so bizarre that regular villagers wouldn't come near it. They ate at other fires and watched from a distance. When Olivia rejoined her friends, the girls immediately started whispering. That marmot is huge, but her voice is so cute. She sounds like she's not even 10. Little Mouse is the prettiest, just doesn't talk much. Kind of seems not very smart. The kobold seems smartest. She waved at me the other day. Then someone noticed something alarming. Doesn't anyone think Leo's social circle is getting a little broad? A marmot-like human girl. A husky-like giant marmot. An actual husky-like kobold. All female. Olivia, you'd better keep your Leo on a short leash. Olivia laughed. What are you worried about? That he's starting a circus? The young widow Agata grabbed Olivia's hand with the gravity of a war veteran. A man who's been single long enough starts thinking donkeys look pretty. Leo sleeps in the same tent as Little Mouse every night. You think it's nothing now, but in 2 years when she fills out? Olivia shook her head. Leo's too thick to think about that. That was the old Leo. Look at him now. Is that the same brainless idiot? Agata gazed at me with a complicated expression. Back in the village, old Leo used to sneak into her bed at night, just to steal her pigs. What a waste of all that muscle. I had no time for romance. After a quick meeting with Uncle Urian and the camp leaders to prepare talking points, I set out the next morning toward the great waterfall with Freya and Fisha carrying gifts. Fisha hadn't wanted to come, but I'd talked her into it with my best propaganda. Shared enemies, united fronts, driving out barbarism, marching towards civilization. A few sentences, and she was carrying the weight of historical destiny for her entire species. I brought her for a practical reason too. The wild folk might shoot first and ask questions never. The more familiar faces I had around me, the less likely I'd catch an arrow. Even if you showed up to someone's doorstep uninvited, if half your group were people they recognized, the fight probably wouldn't happen. We left the peninsula and headed upstream. Me carrying a wooden crate of gifts, Fisha trotting alongside, and Freya bouncing around like an oversized puppy. She dug ditches all yesterday, outworking 100 men, and showed zero fatigue today. She dove into ice-cold pools to splash-bomb fish into her mouth, shook trees hoping squirrels would fall out, and at one point flopped dramatically on the ground. Oh no, I tripped. Ow, ow. Carry me. She held up her stubby paws. I didn't even turn around. She grumbled and followed. Fisha watched Freya enviously. That size, that strength, that thick fur. She could survive alone anywhere without fear. Why were some huskies blessed and others not? We stopped at the boulder where I'd first seen the wild folk hunter. I set down the crate and waited. Within minutes, sharp whistles echoed around us. The wild folk passing signals, probably confirming I hadn't brought an army behind me. I understood their caution. Under imperial law, wild folk had the same legal status as wild animals. Killing one was no different from killing a deer. Slave catching was a legitimate profession. Many pioneer knights took a shortcut. Instead of building from scratch, they'd just raid wild folk villages, seize their farms and people, and skip years of development. For wild folk, being discovered meant potential extinction. No wonder they were hostile to outsiders. A different hunter appeared on the boulder above, same wolf skull helmet, same cold predator's gaze. I immediately raised both hands high. Surrender first, talk later. Just you? The hunter asked in rough but understandable Imperial. I glanced at Fisha and Freya, who'd copied my raised hands pose. Just me. He jumped down, stood face to face with me for a full 10 seconds, then turned to Freya and bowed respectfully. Master, Master? I stared at Freya. She thumped her chest proudly. Druid Master. That's me. The hunter didn't ask why I'd come. He just waved us forward and started walking upstream. He stayed silent the whole way, speaking only once during a rest stop, to Freya. The village misses you. I miss them too, she said shyly. The journey nearly killed me. No trail. Just the hunter picking the least terrible route through cliffs, gorges, ravines, and dense forest. At least 20 miles of mountain terrain. Without a guide, an outsider would hit a dead end within minutes, trapped by sheer drops or box canyons. In the final gorge, I noticed the opposite rock wall was honeycombed with carved niches, each holding a skull, beast, or humanoid. Hundreds of them, packed like a beehive. Half were boarmen skulls, massive with huge tusks. Judging by the weathering, this war between wild folk and boarmen had been going on for generations. Past the gorge, we finally hit an actual path. We climbed a low peak, and the view opened up. Below lay an enormous lake, and at its far end, the great waterfall, the source of the Anzino River, plunged from the impossibly high cliff of the Grand Barrier. What I'd always seen as a distant thread hanging from the clouds was now thundering right in front of me. For low peaks surrounded the waterfall like a crown, forming a basin that caught the cascading water into this huge lake, sitting at least 1,000 meters above the river bend and the plains. Overflow spilled through gaps between the peaks, creating smaller waterfalls that fed the Anzino and other streams. Looking back from up here, I could see our entire peninsula spread out below, the camp, the fields, the tiny ant-like figures of villagers moving around. My stomach dropped. I'd known the wild folk could see us, but seeing it confirmed was different. We were like fish in a pond, thinking we were hidden while someone on the bank watched every move, which meant Fish's assessment was accurate. These were genuinely peaceful people. They could have raided our camp at any point during those vulnerable first days and taken everything: grain, tools, people. Many pioneer settlements failed not because of harsh conditions, but because nearby bandits kept hitting them for years. These wild folk had simply left us alone. Nestled between the peaks and the great cliff was a small village built along the lakeshore. Willow trees lined the water. Narrow strips of farmland were carved into the slopes. Wooden houses had porches and docks extending over the lake, with fishing boats tied underneath. A fishing and hunting settlement with a little farming on the side. It looked like paradise, the kind of hidden mountain village you'd see in a painting. I stared at the idyllic scene, the waterfall roaring in the background, and couldn't help thinking, the people who live here must have terrible joint problems from all this humidity. When we came down from the peak and reached the village entrance, a crowd was already waiting. Hidden scouts must have sent word ahead. The leader was an old man wearing a crown of deer antlers and a cloak of colorful feathers. His dark skin, face, and exposed chest was covered in dense ritual tattoos. The Empire had mostly stamped out the old tattooing traditions, but out here in the wild, the ancient ways still held. From his wrinkles and white hair, I might have guessed he was 70 or 80. But Leo's survival instincts told me he was probably only in his 50s. Like Uncle Urian, looked like a worn-out old farmer, but was actually under 40. In the wilderness, reaching 50 meant you'd been strong enough to survive countless fights without crippling injuries. Behind the old man stood mostly women, children, and elderly. But on every rooftop, stone wall, and watchtower around the village, wild folk hunters stood with longbows in hand. Each one was tall, broad, bearded, faces painted with mud, wearing wolf or bear skull helmets and heavy fur armor decorated with fangs and claws. Every one of them radiated danger. Uncle Urian had told me that many wild folk tribes still practiced the ancient northern coming-of-age ritual, sending teenagers into the wilderness alone to survive like animals until they'd killed something impressive enough to prove their worth. Every adult hunter here had been forged in that crucible. In a one-on-one fight, I wasn't sure I could beat any of them. In a forest skirmish, I'd be a pincushion within seconds. Their longbows drew at close to 200 pounds, heavy enough to kill a brown bear at range. An untrained person couldn't even hold one of those bows level, let alone draw the string. Leo had only ever used homemade 30-pound shortbows good for rabbits. These were a completely different species of weapon. I had absolutely no desire to make enemies here. Greetings, respected elder. I walked up quickly and bowed deeply, not a shred of arrogance in my posture. The old man blinked, caught off guard. He'd clearly expected something very different. In wild folk experience, imperial settlers were no different from hostile tribes. Conquer territory, drive out, or enslave whoever was already there. He'd recalled all his hunters for this meeting specifically to display force, expecting me to march in making territorial claims or demanding taxes and service. He'd lived through it all. Over 50 years, he'd watched the town of Isenball grow, its overflow population spreading into the wilderness, pioneer territories popping up along both banks of the Anzino, at least 10 new settlements in his lifetime. 20 years ago, the wild folk had fought back, raiding vulnerable new villages and logging camps. The retaliation was devastating. The Frelov family sent awakened knights leading elite imperial infantry and experienced mercenary companies into the forest, destroying wild folk settlements and pushing survivors deeper into the mountains. Now his people were backed against the Grand Barrier with nowhere left to retreat. When our camp's first cooking fire appeared on the river bend, the young hunters had wanted to raid us immediately, scare off the newcomers before they dug in. The old man had thought the same way in his youth. But standing on the peak, watching the smoke below grow closer each day, he knew how it would end. Violence might work once, but it always brought something worse. Following the druid's way, he'd learned to think longer. "Be well, child," he replied with a warm smile. "Good. First contact, smiles on both sides." I relaxed slightly and opened the wooden crate. A gift from our headman. I deliberately used headman, the traditional northern term for a village chief. Words like lord, knight, or noble were enemy vocabulary to wild folk ears. Inside the crate, wrapped in oiled linen, lay 2 steel swords from Roman's gift. These were southern forge-made blades, a century ahead of anything northern blacksmiths could produce. Even Isenball's smiths couldn't match this quality. Fine swords. A fine gift. The elder drew one, flicked the blade, and praised it warmly before having it taken away. No false modesty. In the north, refusing a gift was rude. You accepted graciously and returned something of equal value later. The only worry on his face was figuring out what to give back. After exchanging a few words with me, his name was Zervin, the elder turned to Freya. His expression shifted from warm to solemn. He straightened his feather cloak and antler crown, then bowed slowly in an elaborate formal gesture. "Master Freya, Elder Zervin." Freya folded her paws and gave a clumsy bow. The old man stepped aside, and the villagers surged forward. Elderly women held up food offerings on dried lotus leaves, bowing deeply before placing them at Freya's feet. Women and children knelt behind them. A few mischievous wild kids snuck winks at Freya between prostrations. Freya stood stiffly, accepting the worship. This was the first time I'd ever seen her face food without losing her mind. I finally understood why she'd left this village. Too much formality. No room to be herself. Last came a young mother carrying a baby wrapped in cloth. The infant was barely breathing, face gray and pale. She laid it gently in front of Freya. Freya stared at the baby and shook her head firmly. "I don't eat children. Maybe they want you to heal it, not eat it," I said flatly. "Oh." She looked relieved, with a flicker of disappointment. Then she raised her front paw, puffed herself up, and her fur began standing on end, glowing green. The light gathered at her paw, forming a soccer ball-sized sphere of green energy. She released it, and it dropped onto the baby, bursting apart in a wash of light. Color flooded back into the baby's skin. Its eyes snapped open, and it wailed, healthy, angry crying. The mother sobbed with joy, clutching her child, kowtowing to Freya over and over. Freya leaned down and tapped the woman's forehead with one claw, a blessing of sorts, and the mother retreated in tears. I was stunned. The goofy marmot could do real magic. Healing magic. Well, she was an elven druid who could shape-shift. A cure spell made sense. Once the crowd dispersed, I teased her. Accepting bows from your elders shortens your life, you know. She wiped non-existent sweat off her face, still buzzing from successfully casting a spell. Elders? I'm 80 years old. 80, with the intelligence of an 8-year-old? She puffed out her belly proudly. Elves live 800 years, you ignorant human child. Zervin led us into the village and to the Lord's Hall at the far end. Outside the entrance stood a 10-foot wooden statue carved from a massive trunk. The sculptor had clearly tried for fearsome bear, but the head shape, the claws, and especially the front teeth gave away the truth. It was a marmot. A marmot rearing up with its mouth open in a roar. That's my teacher, Freya announced proudly. Grandmaster of the Wild Sect. Guardian of the Forest. Great Druid Bobuk Maramotus, she pointed at herself. And I'm the future Grandmaster. Future Forest Guardian. Future Great Druid. Hee hee. Impressive. A great teacher really does produce a great student. She beamed, then accidentally dropped a packet of food from her arms. It scattered everywhere. She dove flat on the ground, tongue out, frantically licking it up. From chatting with Zervin, I learned the statue's backstory. Freya's teacher, the elven druid Bobuk, had visited this region decades ago and helped this wild folk tribe. The northern people already followed ancestor worship and shamanistic traditions compatible with druidic beliefs, so Bobuk's teachings had taken root naturally. To these people, a shape-shifting elven druid was basically a living god. When Freya fell from the sky, Zervin thought Bobuk himself had returned. Turned out it was just the student. So, I said carefully, you fell off the cliff because you were stealing honey from a beehive and bees stung you. That was Zervin's version of events, and I'd been expecting some tragic backstory. Turns out she was just too embarrassed to admit she'd been stupid. My teacher hibernated for 2 months without leaving me any food, she protested. I hadn't eaten in 2 months. And those bees were horrible. They stung my nostrils. Inside the Lord's Hall, I got down to business. I'm here as a neighbor, with no ill intentions. Our camp isn't a Knight's Pioneer territory, just homeless refugees with nowhere else to go. You've seen us. We're not strong. We could barely handle the kobolds. Zervin studied me. Nobody enters negotiations by showing weakness. Even the weakest side tries to look bigger than it is. So I told him everything honestly. Our village on the North Ice River. The orc raids. Uncle Urian's decision to flee. The 1,000-mile march. The people who left. The attacks. The starvation. I let the fear from Leo's memories pour out. Now we've barely settled in, and we've discovered boarmen nearby. They're our common enemy. If we work together to defeat them, both our peoples will be safer. Zervin looked at me for a long time. Child, your honesty moves me. I'm glad suffering hasn't destroyed your people. The Basaka welcome you as neighbors, he paused. But we will not join your fight. Basaka, warriors who wear bearskin, was what the local wild folk called themselves. According to northern legend, the war god Tyr had 100 sons whose descendants became 100 clans. The Basaka traced their lineage to one of those sons, just as the great Count families traced theirs to others. Why not? I pressed. Clearing this threat together would give both our peoples more room to survive. Child, the enemies of the wilderness can never be fully killed. Zervin spoke patiently. Drive away one boarman tribe, and something stronger moves in. More boarmen, hyena men, or perhaps empire men. Open war means losses on both sides, and a third-party profits. What we can do is trim their numbers, balance the powers, maintain equilibrium. I went quiet. He had a point. The Wolf Drive Plains held more than just one boarman tribe. Every battle cost lives the wild folk couldn't replace. And even if we cleared the wilderness together, who would claim it? Imperial settlers, flooding in to grab the empty land. Zervin's strategy was actually clever. His small tribe was remote, poor, and hidden, not worth a military expedition or even a slaving party. By selectively culling nearby threats and letting weaker tribes survive as a buffer zone, he'd created a shield of enemies around his territory. Using enemies to protect yourself. Centuries of survival wisdom. Elder, times have changed. I grabbed a handful of sunflower seeds from the table and scattered them. These are the Basaka. I added almonds next to them. These are the wild tribes, then dried dates on the far side. These are the orcs. I pushed the dates forward. Under the pressure, the seeds and almonds jumbled together. The orcs are already moving south. Maybe the Empire pushes them back someday. But that could take 1 year, 3, 5, 10. And orcs don't just raid humans. Every creature in the Wolf Drive Plains will be displaced too. Wild tribes migrating south, stronger replacing weaker, the whole balance reshuffled. Maybe within a year, that Boorman tribe grows from 200 to 1,000. Or maybe something worse overruns them overnight. Are you ready for that? Zervin looked at the scattered seeds and smiled. These sunflower seeds should represent your people, not ours, sharp old man. If orc-driven tribes really swept south, they'd hit the fertile river bend first, not his hidden mountain village. Does it matter? To the wild tribes, we're all human. If the river bend falls, the Basaka stand alone. Same ending. Then I made my real ask. I'm not asking for much. The river bend will keep growing, taking in refugees, building strength, blocking whatever comes south. We have Isenball's support too. All I'm asking is this. When our fighters stand in a shield wall against the enemy, the Basaka shoot their arrows from the side instead of watching from the mountaintop. Afterward, the Basaka are still the Basaka. The river bend is still the river bend. And everyone's still alive. Zervin stared at the table, unmoved. 50 years of survival instinct wouldn't bend to a teenager's speech, however logical. The orc migration wasn't confirmed. The wilderness hadn't visibly shifted yet. My words needed proof before they became facts. I didn't push. Establishing contact, having a rational conversation, and laying out the bigger picture. That was enough for today. That evening, I enjoyed a campfire dinner of wild-style roasted meat. The wild folk put us up in the Lord's Hall by the fire, on thick fur bedding, their finest hospitality. During the night, 2 young wild folk women climbed into my bed. One clearly had experience. Deep in the mountains with no outside contact, these isolated tribes had to get creative about bloodlines, trading brides between neighboring villages, or simply presenting newcomers with willing partners. A healthy young outsider like me was prime genetic material. They'd even paired an experienced girl with a novice, just to make sure. I politely declined. Not because I didn't want to, but I couldn't possibly do anything with Fisha and Freya staring at me with curious eyes from across the room. We were all sleeping in the same hall. Next morning, Elder Zervin gave me a parting gift, a longbow and a quiver of heavy arrows. Fisha got a bearskin blanket. Freya received endless pleas to stay and armfuls of food, which she was deeply touched by, but she chose to leave anyway. She missed Olivia's flatbread. On the mountaintop before, heading down, Freya walked to a cliff edge overlooking the vast plains, the silver ribbon of the Anzino winding into the distance, the grand barrier disappearing into the clouds behind her. Stand back, she told us. Further, when Fisha and I were 10 meters away, Freya took a deep breath and screamed. AHH, a dolphin-pitched shriek that drilled straight through my skull. Even from behind her, 10 meters away, Fisha and I clamped our hands over our ears. She screamed twice, then turned around happily. My teacher has amazing ears. He can hear me from 100 miles away. Back at camp, I reported to Uncle Urian. Not bad. At least we don't have to worry about the wild folks stabbing us in the back. He nodded. Keep training the militia, get some equipment together, and watch the river crossing for Boorman. And keep building that relationship with the wild folk. As I walked away, I heard him sigh behind me. He really has grown up. Old Rusev, the shopkeeper, tapped his empty pipe. He'd smoked through his tobacco supply halfway through the migration. Then marry your daughter to him already. Get some grandkids. Absolutely not. What does he have to offer my precious girl? Fair point. Too wild. Way too wild. Rusev shook his head. Then after a pause, Olivia really is a wonderful girl though. Shame to waste her on anyone else. I had plenty to keep busy with. Bribing Freya with food to keep digging the canal. Pushing militia training harder. And my ongoing war against public defecation. I'd actually organized a children's brigade armed with sticks, ordered to poke the backside of anyone caught relieving themselves outside the latrines. Camp echoed daily with men's curses and women's shrieks. During training sessions, I'd pull out the longbow from Elder Zervin in practice. The thing had a nearly 200-pound draw. Even with this body's raw strength, I had to strain to pull it, careful not to tear a tendon. I started with just drawing the string to build up my back and core strength, only adding arrows once my body adapted. Uncle Urian would coach me when he saw me practicing. He'd served alongside Imperial longbowmen at the Wind God Fortress and knew their form, stance, draw technique, release, which was different from a regular hunter's style. His guidance saved me months of fumbling. The iron for grain trade with the kobolds kept flowing through the Petakov fishing boats, temporarily solving our food crisis. And Freya was a game-changer for labor. She wasn't just a canal digger. Anything too heavy for humans, she handled effortlessly. Multi-ton boulders? She'd headbutt them into pieces, then push the chunks around like snowballs. The Lord's Hall Foundation, originally planned at 3 feet of stone, was now raised to over 6 feet thanks to her. The only problem was supervision. Leave her alone for 5 minutes, and disaster struck. Uncle Urian seized the momentum, crafting more shields and expanding the militia back to 50 men. New recruits still carried their own axes and spears since we lacked standard weapons. Another 50 young men were selected as reserves, training alongside the regulars every evening. With food no longer scarce, Olivia started giving everyone bigger portions on Uncle Urian's orders. The villagers filled out visibly, no longer the walking skeletons who'd stumbled into the river bend. With energy to spare after work, the men needed something to do besides fighting and harassing women. So evening drills on the riverbank became a daily event. 100 men training together actually looked impressive and gave everyone a sense of security. Little Mouse still followed me everywhere when I was around, and helped Olivia when I wasn't. The other village kids had stopped chasing her away. They mostly just ignored her now, which was progress. She was still wary of everything, still liked hiding in my tent or fishing alone at her little pools. She'd only really smile when I teased her. She'd stopped pouring leftover porridge into her pockets, at least, though she still hid bread scraps under her blanket. When Freya arrived, she and Little Mouse became instant friends, my 2 resident idiots, left and right. Freya even let Little Mouse and Olivia ride on her back, along with Olivia's 26 kobold, adopted children, on expeditions to the western oak forest to chase off evil kobolds. Wait, 26? There were only 20 before. I counted the pups in the pen 3 times, pulled out a few that were clearly malnourished newcomers, and confronted Fisha. Did you sneak extra kids in here? The husky's eyes darted sideways. They followed on their own. Then she gathered her courage. You said, adult kobolds can also come to camp. Sure, send whoever you want. But only workers get fed. I didn't care. Managing them was Uncle Urian's problem. We were desperately short on labor everywhere. If kobolds could work, why not? Fish's eyes lit up as she started mentally cataloging what her people could do. By the Lord's Hall, the big bald man Valeri was building a furnace against the outer wall, a tall bottle-shaped thing, 3 meters high. Uncle Urian and the other leaders stood around it, buzzing with excitement. What's that? I asked. An iron smelting furnace. Valeri spent 5 years as a blacksmith's apprentice. If this thing works, we can smelt the kobold or into iron ingots ourselves. That got me excited too. In Isenball, proper iron ingots sold for 5 times the price of raw ore. This furnace could triple our trade profits overnight. But I had my doubts. 5 years and still just an apprentice. Everyone laughed at my ignorance. Blacksmithing was a premium trade in the north. Masters guarded their secrets fiercely. Valeri had spent 3 years just pumping bellows, splitting firewood, and doing chores before he ever touched a hammer. After 5 years, he could cast basic ingots, but his master had never taught him actual forging technique. He'd learned what little he knew by watching from the side. When his master got called up by the local lord to make weapons, the old man left without taking Valeri. So Valeri taught himself carpentry, masonry, and whatever else he could pick up. He was our only real craftsman, the reason we dared attempt building the Lord's Hall at all. I watched the furnace construction and couldn't contribute much. I could lecture anyone about the history of iron smelting, but actual practical details? Blank. Then it hit me. The kobolds have their own blacksmiths, right? Why not bring one over? They could share techniques with Valeri. Maybe we won't need to buy tools at all. Uncle Urian slapped the table. Great idea. Go get one. Why me? Who else? The kobolds trust you most. I could ask, and they'd just bark at me. I grumbled, but went. Freya abandoned her ditch digging the moment she saw me heading out. I want to come play. The Kobold Valley wasn't far. There Their ore-hauling teams had worn a clear path up the hillside. Kobold sentries spotted us and started barking in alarm. Some ran to warn the valley. Others raised weapons nervously. But as we got closer, they hid their weapons behind their backs and hunched their shoulders like kids caught misbehaving. Inside the valley, the elderly kobolds panicked at Freya's size. Some ran screaming. The giant beast had finally come to eat them. Freya played it up, standing tall and waving her claws, scattering kobolds everywhere. I appreciated the effect. A little intimidation goes a long way toward keeping the peace. But I also noticed something important. The kobolds had upgraded. After losing most of their warriors fighting us, the remaining adults had reorganized. They carried bark and wood shields, short spears or iron picks, sling pouches at their belts, and stone ammunition. Some even had 3 or 4 javelins strapped to their backs. Every single one had a sling. They looked like a budget version of our militia. Even more impressive, when Freya spooked them, instead of scattering, they instinctively clustered into a defensive formation. Shield wall. The old kobolds would have broken and run. These held position. Fisha the Husky had been chief for barely 2 weeks, and she'd already transformed her tribe's military capabilities. She'd maxed out her domestic policy skill tree while looking stupid the whole time. When I explained why I'd come, Fisha nodded immediately. Come, she led us deep into the valley to the kobold smithy. There, furnaces were nothing like ours, just small mounds of clay, barely a meter tall, about a dozen of them. Half were still smoking while kobolds pumped air into them with squeezed bellows. 2 soot-black little kobolds were crawling inside a cooled mound, picking out sand grain-sized iron pellets. These got collected in clay pots, and when there were enough, they'd be reheated into lumps of sponge iron. Beside the furnaces, 4 muscular kobolds hammered away at 2 anvils, shaping red-hot sponge iron into tools and weapons. An elderly kobold in a grass crown and feather-leaf cape danced and chanted nearby. The tribal priest, blessing the forge. Standing in the middle of it all, I felt like I'd traveled back to the Stone Age. Our blacksmith, Fisha, said, "You can take one." Unlike most kobolds, who treated their crude smelting process as sacred magic, Fisha considered it simple and unremarkable, nothing worth hiding. I walked up to the 4 kobold blacksmiths. "Which one of you is the best?" They stopped hammering, stared at me blankly, then all pointed at the same person, Fisha. So did every other kobold in earshot. Even the old shaman priest chimed in with broken imperial. "Fisha, princess, most skilled, at everything, most skilled. You're the best blacksmith?" I couldn't believe it. Fisha wagged her tail. "Kobold chief must be strong or smart." "I, princess, smart and strong." "I see something." I learned she had a point. As a female kobold, she'd been ranked below 30 other candidates for leadership. A kobold tribe normally had a powerful chief, a shaman, a head blacksmith, 7 or 8 hunting squad leaders, and a third of the tribe as warriors, all outranking bloodline. For Fisha to become chief, she had to outshine everyone. Our battles had helped, of course. We'd killed most of their strongest warriors. And the old shaman was useless, couldn't cast a single fireball, only taught everyone to sing and dance. What she didn't mention was that even the clay mound furnaces were her innovation, inspired by visiting the wild folk. Before her, the kobolds didn't even have furnaces, just open pits where they'd grind ore into powder, roll it into clay balls, and burn it under charcoal for 3 days, hoping for the best. Adding a clay dome doubled their iron yield. She'd also reorganized the hunting squads, copied our military tactics and weapons, assigned every kobold a job, and was even trying to build walls around the valley. "I had no idea you were this smart," I told her, and I meant it completely. I couldn't take Fisha herself. I needed her running the kobold tribe so nobody stupid and aggressive replaced her. So I brought back one of the regular blacksmiths. The poor guy didn't speak Imperial, was terrified of humans, and almost bolted back to the valley twice. But I figured a few meals from our kitchen would fix his loyalty problem. He sat alone in the middle of camp, completely lost, while Olivia tried sending kobold pups to comfort him. The male kobold snarled and chased them away. He wanted nothing to do with babies. Why is it that in every other transmigration story, the hero immediately meets a master dwarven blacksmith who pledges eternal loyalty? I muttered, lying with my head in Olivia's lap. I can't even get a ghost to show up. My only real blacksmith is a half-trained apprentice, and I had to go kidnap a kobold to fill the gap. Everything in this world, I have to do myself. Olivia ignored my rambling, resting her account book on my forehead, writing down the day's trades and expenses. The numbers were looking better. We have a month's food stored now. We can start trading or for other things. 15 pounds of cheese, 10 pounds of nails, 2 spinning wheels, 20 logging axes. In the distance, Valeri's crew hoisted a roof beam for the Lord's Hall with a unified shout. The first floor was taking shape. Freya lay sprawled in the middle of camp, caked in mud from ditch digging, waving her stubby paws in the air. I'm not getting up. I want a hot bath. My frustration faded. I wasn't alone in this. Everyone was working hard, building a home. That night, just as I was falling asleep, the tent flap opened and Olivia slipped in wearing a linen nightgown so thin from washing that the firelight outside turned it nearly transparent. "What are you doing?" I glared. She lay down beside me, grabbing my arm in the cramped space. "I'm here to make sure you don't bother little mouse." "I'm supervising." "Supervising?" More like a lamb walking into a tiger's den. I rolled on top of her, propping myself up on my arms, but I could still feel the soft pressure of her chest against mine. The air thickened. The moment built. Then little mouse, watching from by my feet, let out a sudden shriek. A massive animal head was pushing through the tent flap. "Get out! Get out!" 3 people, 6 feet, all pressed against the marmot's forehead, desperately trying to shove her back outside. "I want to sleep in the tent, too." Freya forced her way in with unstoppable determination. Crash. The poor little tent finally gave up and collapsed on all of us. After a few days of rest, I couldn't take the monotony anymore. Every day was the same, backbreaking labor. Uncle Urian kept trying to chain me to dam building or beam hauling duty. Me, the future squire of a future pioneer knight, doing grunt work. I packed my gear before dawn and slipped across the Anzino into the Wolf Drive Plains. This was going to be our battlefield someday. The Boermen hadn't found our camp yet, but they would. Rather than wait for them to show up at our doorstep, I wanted to know every hill, valley, and choke point on their side of the river. I spent hours climbing ridges and memorizing the terrain. Then I found them. In a sheltered valley, not even 2 hours' walk from the river bend, a Boerman hunting party was camped around a fire. 5 warriors warming themselves, for massive horned boars lying beside them. 3 more warriors stood guard on the high ground with crossbows. I estimated the distance to the nearest sentry, pulled out my longbow, and started creeping closer. 1 shot, then run, just for the thrill. A soft whistle stopped me cold. I spun around. 20 meters back, a bear skull helmet was facing me. Under it, a bearded face, a wild folk hunter, signaling me to hold. 2 more hunters were hidden nearby, so well camouflaged in their bear and wolf pelts that I hadn't spotted them from 5 meters away. The lead hunter raised his longbow, gestured, "Follow me," and moved toward the valley. We crept to within 100 meters of the campfire. Then, from somewhere I couldn't see, bowstrings twanged. All 3 sentries on the ridgeline took arrows to the head simultaneously and tumbled down without a sound. Before the warriors at the fire could react, my 3 companions drew and fired. 3 heavy arrows screamed across the gap. 2 punched clean through skulls and chests, the iron broadheads poking out the other side, slightly bent from the impact. The 3rd warrior rolled sideways, just in time. The arrow hit his hand instead, and the force blew it apart, fingers flying in different directions. Even with a destroyed hand, the Boerman howled but didn't break. He grabbed his weapon one-handed and charged with his 2 surviving comrades. I stood there in awe. These wild folk hunters were like keyboard warriors from my previous life come to life. Every single one could hit a bullseye at 100 meters. I'd been practicing the longbow daily and still couldn't guarantee accuracy beyond 50 meters. The hunters didn't pause. Arrows flowed out in a continuous stream from all directions, turning the charging Boermen into pincushions. The 3 warriors managed about 10 meters, got off 1 crossbow volley each, and went down rolling. I fired 2. My arrow sailed past the nearest Boerman and disappeared into the forest. Missed. In seconds, the entire 8-man hunting party was dead. Only the 4 frenzied, horned boars remained. The hunters dealt with those efficiently, Everyone climbed a tree and held on. I scrambled up too, barely 6 meters high, when the trunk exploded with impact. A horned boar had rammed it full force, driving its foot-long horn completely into the wood. The tree shook so hard I nearly flew off. The boar struggled to pull free. I drew my steel sword, gripped it point down with both hands, and jumped. Gravity plus body weight drove the blade deep into the boar's neck, almost through to the other side.